Chapter 780. Even though he had seen the sea of flowers, Meg was still terrified. Just as his hand was about to touch that soft ball, he withdrew his hand like lightning. Sure enough, he wasn't afraid of forceful or gentle people, but he was afraid of people who didn't play by the rules. Although Meg wasn't very shameless, he was a person who kept his nose clean. He couldn't just touch anyone who asked him to. That went against his principles. Damn it, after so many years, you still haven't changed at all. Irina looked at Meg's frightened expression and let out a bell-like laugh, as if she had thought of something very funny. Meg looked at Irina with mixed feelings. Alex's memories had merged with his, but he still couldn't calmly treat himself as Alex and accept Irina. Alex had deleted all memories related to Irina. To him, she was just an elf girl whom he had only known for 2 days. Although she was Amy's mother and had an extremely beautiful appearance and a likable, straightforward personality, Meg still couldn't calmly embrace her using Alex's identity. Was he that kind of person? It's been 3 years, I've finally found you. Irina threw herself into Meg's arms and hugged him tightly as if she wanted to meld herself into his body. Her murmur was filled with joy and difficulty. Meg's outstretched arms froze for a moment. He felt the little girl in his arms like a little girl, and his heart gradually softened. He slowly retracted his arms. One of his arms was around her waist, and the other hand was stroking her back gently. This girl who had once left her name on the Magus Tower, this elf princess who dared to face 6 10th-tier powerhouses alone, this woman who dared to challenge the entire world for him and Amy, at this moment, seemed so petite and weak. The torrential rain continued to fall outside the magic barrier, but there was no need for words or consolation. Meg held Irina gently in his arms and just wanted to bask in this moment of peace. In that instant, an impulse suddenly welled up in his heart. If Irina became the lady boss of the restaurant, perhaps it would be very interesting for the 3 of them to live together as a family. The griffin continued to fly toward the west before landing at the entrance of the cave on Amnesty Mountain. It turned to look at Meg with an excited expression, and let loose a couple of cries. Howl. You're a griffin, not a husky. Meg rolled his eyes and couldn't help but grumble internally. How could a griffin let out such a cry? Irina sat up in Meg's arms and looked at Meg's mask. Is there something on my face? Meg asked, feeling a little uncomfortable being stared at. Irina nodded. It's a little ugly. Meg felt as if something was stuck in his throat. He suddenly felt as if he had met his match. Irina pulled Meg's mask up to reveal his face. After a brief daze, she nodded with a pleased expression. That's a lot better. Meg was also slightly dazed. In order to avoid any awkwardness, he dismounted from the griffin's back and began to inspect the cave. The magic barrier had already been withdrawn by Irina, and a green ball of light hovered beside her, illuminating the entire cave with its gentle light. There were signs of griffin activity everywhere, and there was a pile of bones in a corner of the cave. He looked at the purple-striped griffin, which was wagging its tail at him and rubbing its head against his body, and he was suddenly struck by a sense of pity. Meg gently stroked the scar on the griffin's forehead, and memories of the battles he had fought alongside it flashed through his mind. During these 3 years, it had been guarding this place, never leaving. When he needed help the most, it was like a divine soldier had descended from the heavens. No matter how dangerous the situation was, no matter how powerful the opponent was, it never seemed to be afraid. Arzi. Meg called out in a gentle voice. Haha tilde. Arzi became even more excited. It wagged its tail vigorously and stuck out its tongue to lick Meg's face, just like a dog that hadn't seen its owner in a long time. Meg couldn't accept the eagerness of Arzi's saliva. He pressed down on Arzi's head, and ordered, sit down. Arzi is still as silly as ever after 3 years. I should have named it Silly Arzi. How about we change its name from today onward? Irina made her way over to Arzi, and patted its head with a serious expression. So she was the one who came up with this strange name. Meg slapped his forehead. She had named the cat Ugly Duckling, and she had named the griffin Arzi. This mother-daughter pair had perfectly inherited her talent for naming. Meg's heart ached for the griffin for a second before he tried to refuse. I don't think we should change its name. Arzi sounds like a good name. Irina shook her head with a serious expression, and said, "No, names are very important. Silly Azados Griffin is just like its name, and it's so affectionate, just like our silly son." Well, Meg didn't know how to refute her words. "Meg, Alex, which name would you like me to call you now?" Irina interrupted Meg's train of thought. "Let's call you Meg." Meg replied without any hesitation. Even though it wasn't a new name, perhaps a new name would be a good start for him. Meg. That's not a bad name either. Irina nodded as she walked around Meg 3 times with a scrutinizing look on her face. "What happened 3 years ago? How did you become like this? What's with the peak power you just recovered? What did you experience with Amy during these 3 years? How did you learn to cook? Did you have any intimate contact with other women during these 3 years?" The barrage of questions almost knocked Meg out cold. He was looking at Irina with a slightly different expression. He had thought that a fairy like her would be aloof from all matters, but who would have thought that she would be no different from an ordinary little girl? "These questions are a little complicated to answer. If I were to answer all of them, it would take me 3 days and 3 nights to answer all of them." Meg averted his gaze slightly. What a joke. Was he supposed to tell her that he had transmigrated into this world and brought a system with him? Meg would never tell anyone about transmigrators and the system. It was not a good thing for someone to know about something that was beyond the imagination of this world. Chapter 781. Due to the fact that the Demon Alliance's plan had completely failed, and no one had kept the news under wraps, the news of Alex's survival quickly spread throughout Rodu as if it had sprouted wings. Anyone with a certain level of status was made aware of this, and it created quite a stir. Alex had already become a special symbol in the Roth Empire. He was the invincible war god on the border, and the dragon-slaying warrior who could fly into the sky and slay dragons. He was extremely revered in the hearts of the common people. He was the pride of the human race, and he had declared his sovereignty to the heavens, forcing the giant dragons to bow their heads to humans, who they had always viewed as ants. 3 years ago, Alex had passed away, and the entire empire was in mourning. Long lines of mourners from all over the Roth Empire stretched for close to 10 kilometers, demonstrating just how much he was loved and revered. Everyone believed that Alex had already passed away, as with his personality, there was no way that he would remain silent for 3 years. Who would have thought that Alex would appear again amid the thunderstorm tonight, and announce to the world that he was back? Many people in Rodu were destined to be sleepless that night. "Your Highness, Alex has appeared and rescued Irina. The plan has failed." A black figure appeared outside the attic. Rainwater was dripping down from his clothes, and he appeared to be in quite a sorry state. Sean looked at the rain in silence for a long while before slowly turning around and saying in a cold voice, "Kill some people and cut ties with me." Quinn's expression stiffened, but he still immediately replied, "Yes," before disappearing into the rainy night again. "Alex, you're always the one who foils my plans. As expected, I shouldn't have kicked you out of that street 3 years ago." Sean looked at the rainy night sky of Rodu with a ferocious expression. "Benson is dead." On the top floor of the palace's tall tower, a figure silently appeared and spoke in a slightly hoarse voice. "Very good." Andre was still looking outside, and a sense of pride welled up in his heart as he chortled, "I've been waiting for this day for several decades. If I can see the border of the Roth Empire as the border of the Norland continent before I die, my name will forever be etched into the history of the Norland continent." The black figure remained silent. "It's time to form a new alliance with the elves. These fools are excellent cannon fodder." Andre retracted his gaze and walked down the stairs. "The ice cream cake is really delicious, but where did Father go? Isn't it a pity that I'm the only one eating such a delicious cake?" In the kitchen, Remi looked at the ice cream cake that had a corner dug out with a look of pity on her face. The base of the ice cream cake had its own cooling function. Although the cooling effect couldn't reach 0 degrees Celsius after leaving the fridge, it was still quite effective in delaying the melting of the ice cream cake. At least for now, the ice cream cake didn't show any signs of melting. Meow meow tilde ugly duckling circled around Amy's chair over and over again, and looked up at the ice cream cake on the table with yearning in its eyes. It really loved ice cream, but it hadn't been able to eat it after coming to Rodu. Who would have thought that there would be such a massive ice cream cake here? It was even larger than its body, so it had to be super delicious. Amy looked down at Ugly Duckling with a serious expression, and said, "Father said that eating too much ice cream will make you fat." "Ugly Duckling, you're already so fat. If you keep eating ice cream, you'll become a roast goose soon." Meow. Ugly Duckling withdrew its head in a horrified manner, but it still couldn't get rid of the yearning in its eyes as it stared at the ice cream on the table. It was looking at Amy with a pitiable expression, and it was as if tears were about to flow from its eyes. "All right, then I'll only have a small bite," Amy said with a resigned expression. Meow meow. Ugly Duckling rubbed its little head against Amy's calf with excitement. "You're going to die from being fat." Amy stood up and placed a small plate on the ground. She then used a small knife to slice off a small piece of ice cream cake with some difficulty, and placed it onto the plate before carefully placing it on the ground. The triangular cake was covered with pink ice cream, and the creamy yellow cake could be seen through the side of the cut. There was also half a strawberry on top, and the aroma of the cake and strawberry wafted toward Ugly Duckling, making its eyes immediately light up. It slowly made its way over to the plate, and circled it around the plate twice before reaching out with its little pink paw to try and touch it. However, its paw stopped halfway, and it slowly withdrew its paw. It stuck its little pink nose forward to take a sniff, and a human-like elated smile appeared on its little face as it prepared to lick the cake. Right at this moment, a faint golden light lit up in the kitchen. Ugly Duckling faltered slightly upon seeing this. Two figures appeared in the room. Splat! A pair of large feet appeared right above the cake, and the cake was squashed flat. Ice cream splattered all over Ugly Duckling's face, and it looked at the empty plate with confusion and grief. "Father." "Big sister Irina." Amy was elated to see the two figures that had suddenly appeared in the room, and her eyes were filled with incredulity. Meg's foot slipped, and he had to grab onto a nearby table to prevent himself from falling. He looked down at the flattened ice cream cake, then met Ugly Duckling's aggrieved gaze, and he was immediately struck by a sense of guilt. He withdrew his foot with an awkward expression, and turned to Amy with a gentle smile as he said, "We're back, Amy." The battle that night had been very short, but it had been extremely perilous. The battle with Benson had been fraught with peril, and the final figure that had appeared on the 5th Street had most likely come from the Royal Palace. He was an opponent that even Alex couldn't fathom as no one had ever seen him in action, and no one was even sure if he really existed. However, the fact that Andre had been able to sit on the throne for several decades seemed to indicate everything. He was sure that if he hadn't changed the direction of his final attack toward Josh, it would have been very difficult for him to leave the 5th Street after losing his peak power. However, he was also sure of one thing, and that was that Andre had already allowed him to live. Meg didn't feel that there was anything to be grateful for. He was more valuable to the Roth Empire alive than dead. Meg was feeling very fortunate that he had been able to return alive tonight. Of course, the most important thing was that he had successfully moved to another location and avoided Irina's barrage of questions. Those questions were extremely perilous, and Meg didn't dare to answer them for his own safety. Chapter 782. They had only eaten a corner of the ice cream cake on the table, and the slice was just enough to reveal the layers of the cake. The pink ice cream and creamy yellow cake were as intricately crafted as a work of art, and the intoxicating aroma wafted through the air. All of this made Irina's eyes light up. Meg was a little speechless. Irina had appeared to be very concerned about Amy in the cave, but who would have thought that she would be drawn to the ice cream cake as soon as she got to the kitchen? Could it be that Amy's foodie trait was also inherited? "No, I was waiting for Father to come back so that we could eat together." Amy shook her head before looking at Meg and Irina with a perplexed expression. "Father, you said that you had something important to do, but you came back with big sister Irina. Looks like there's something more important than eating cake with Irina. Is it to change into some cool clothes and bring big sister Irina back to eat ice cream cake together?" "Well..." Meg looked at Amy, contemplating how he should explain this to Amy. After all, it wasn't appropriate for him to tell her that he had abandoned her to save Irina, but he couldn't let her think that he didn't value her. "Oh, I understand. It's all right." Before Meg had a chance to say anything, a thought suddenly occurred to Amy, and she shook her head generously as if she had seen through everything. What do you understand now? Meg looked at Amy's expression. He didn't know what she was thinking, but he didn't know how to explain it. Now was clearly not a good time to tell her that Irina was her mother. There were many people in this world who wanted to kill him, and he didn't have the power to protect Amy and Irina. 3 years ago, they dared to kill Alex in Rodu, and 3 years later, they dared to kill Irina in the same place. Once his identity was exposed, those people would know that he was in Chaos City and that his power had not recovered to its peak. Those people were bound to be like jackals and wolves that had smelled blood. At that time, neither he nor Irina could guarantee Amy's safety. Since there was no way to meet her openly, Meg was willing to postpone the meeting. Rather than letting her know who her mother was and not being able to meet her in the wind forest, Meg would rather let Amy worry about the moon for the time being. When he had the ability to protect them, he would tell her who her mother was. He had already mentioned this matter to Irina in the cave. She hesitated for a moment, but still agreed with Meg's approach. If he brought me back because of something important, then it's still normal. But if he brought back another woman? Irina looked at Meg with a dangerous smile. A chill ran down Meg's spine, and he recoiled awkwardly. He looked at the projection of himself that was standing off to the side, and smiled as he said, "Let's put this illusion away for now, Amy." "All right." Amy nodded obediently. She waved her little hand, and the projection disappeared. Meow Tilda. Right at this moment, a feeble voice sounded from within Irina's wide sleeves, and a small black head popped out. Its green eyes carefully scanned the surroundings, and its timid appearance appeared rather pitiful. Ugly Duckling, who was looking at the ice cream cake that had been crushed by Meg's foot, faltered momentarily. It abruptly raised its head, and its back arched at the sight of the black cat. Its orange fur stood on end, and it was as if it had entered into a battle mode, ready to pounce at any moment. This was the first time it had seen another cat, and its reaction was even more exaggerated than when it had seen a giant dragon. Meow. The black cat was given a fright, and shrank its head back. Is it another ugly duckling? Amy looked at the black cat in Irina's hand with curiosity in her eyes. She carefully examined it for a while before shaking her head as she said, "No, it's much prettier than Ugly Duckling. This should be a little black cat, not Ugly Duckling." Meow Tilda. Ugly Duckling meowed at Amy with an aggrieved expression. Was it really that ugly? It was clearly much prettier than that black guy. It's all right, you're the ugliest. Amy squatted down and patted Ugly Duckling's head as she consoled it. Meow Tilda. Ugly Duckling lowered its head in dejection. The black cat carefully poked its head out again, and looked at Ugly Duckling with curiosity in its eyes. Irina held the black cat by the scruff of its neck, and carefully examined it for a while before nodding as she said, "You're so dark, so I'll call you Night. If anyone asks why you're so dark in the future, you can tell them it's because your name is Night." Is that a lame joke? Meg raised an eyebrow. Wow, that's such a cool name. Amy's eyes immediately lit up. She thought to herself for a moment before excitedly asking, "Then should we buy another white cat and name it Day?" "That's a good name." Irina nodded in agreement. She then looked at Night before shaking her head as she said, "But let's talk about a white cat later. Day doesn't understand the darkness of night." Meg massaged his brows. As expected, the mother and daughter's brains were wired in tandem. Irina placed the black cat on the ground with a serious expression, and said, "Go play in the ground. If you can't even beat that fat orange, then don't tell anyone that you're my cat." As soon as Night landed on the ground, it reflexively shrank toward Irina's feet. Its emerald-like eyes were filled with curiosity as it looked at Ugly Duckling. After hearing Irina's words, it mustered up its courage and meowed at Ugly Duckling. Night was also a kitten, but it was a lot bigger than Ugly Duckling. It was a female kitten that was at least 3 or 4 months old. However, due to its malnutrition, it looked very thin and frail. Compared to the chubby Ugly Duckling, it was about the same size. Ugly Duckling immediately shrank behind Amy and looked at Night with a nervous expression, seemingly a little scared. "Ugly Duckling, you're so timid. If you keep acting like this, then don't tell anyone that you're my duck." Amy pouted as she looked at Ugly Duckling with a serious expression. Meow tilde ugly duckling looked at Amy with an aggrieved expression before reluctantly making its way out from behind her. Meow. Knight meowed at ugly duckling again before taking a tentative step forward. Meow tilde ugly duckling looked up at Amy and didn't dare to take another step back. However, it didn't dare to take another step forward either as it looked at Knight. In a panic, it lay down on the ground before rolling around and wagging its little tail as a gesture of goodwill. That's so embarrassing. I've never had a duck like you. Chapter 783. Because of the two little ones, their reunion on this rainy night became a lot more relaxing and heartwarming. The warm yellow lights seemed to have completely blocked out the cold and torrential rain outside. Mag walked along the corridor and found a secluded corner to change his clothes. He returned to his room and closed the window. He looked at the mother and daughter who were still encouraging the two kittens to fight each other, and picked up a small knife. He cut off 3 pieces of ice cream cake and placed them on a small plate. After that, he cut off 2 smaller pieces of cake and placed them on another small plate. Have some ice cream cake. It's going to melt soon. Meg handed the ice cream cake to Amy and Irina. Ugly duckling immediately withdrew its gaze from Knight and looked up at Meg with an aggrieved expression. It was about to eat the ice cream cake, but it was crushed by Meg's foot. The more it thought about it, the more aggrieved it felt. Knight was also looking up at Meg with a curious expression. It didn't know what that was, but it was still curious about everything. Meg was a little embarrassed by Ugly Duckling's aggrieved expression. After all, he was the one who had crushed its cake. He placed 2 small plates in front of Ugly Duckling and Knight with a smile, and said, "This is for you." Meow, meow. An excited look appeared on Ugly Duckling's face again. It leaned over to the ice cream cake and took a sniff. It then licked the ice cream with its little tongue, and its eyes immediately narrowed with a blissful expression. Meow. Knight looked at Ugly Duckling licking the ice cream cake with a curious expression. It then looked at the ice cream cake in front of it, and a sweet aroma wafted toward it. This was an aroma that it had never smelled before, and its eyes immediately lit up. After a moment of hesitation, it also stuck out its little tongue and licked the ice cream like Ugly Duckling did. The icy cold sensation immediately made it retract its tongue. It was given a fright and fell over, and it stared at the cake with a dumbstruck expression. However, aside from the icy cold sensation, the fragrant strawberry ice cream melted on the tip of its tongue, giving it a delicious experience that it had never experienced before, and its eyes lit up again. It stared at the ice cream cake for a moment before taking a glance at Ugly Duckling, which was licking the ice cream one mouthful after another. In the end, Knight couldn't help but slowly make its way over to the ice cream cake and try to lick it again. On this occasion, the icy cold sensation didn't make it retreat in horror. Instead, it squatted down in front of the plate and licked the ice cream cake with elation just like Ugly Duckling. Ice cream cake. Irina took the small plate and looked at the delicate-looking cake that was cut into a triangular shape. The pink ice cream covered the top and sides of the cake, and she could see the distinct layers of the cake through the smooth cut. The creamy yellow cake and pink ice cream looked so adorable and intricate. Half a strawberry adorned the top of the cake, and the aroma of the strawberry and cake wafted toward her. Just the sight of it made her salivate. That's right. Father and Amy spent the entire afternoon making it. It's a super delicious ice cream cake, and only big sister Irina gets to eat it. Amy nodded as she placed the plate on the table beside her. She then scooped up a slice of cake with a small spoon, and put it into her mouth. Her eyebrows immediately curved into crescents, and a blissful expression appeared on her little face. She swayed her body from side to side in a very adorable manner. Little girl. A smile appeared on Irina's face at the sight of Amy's adorable expression. She then looked at the ice cream cake in her hand, and an expectant look appeared in her eyes. This was a cake made by the 2 most important people in her life. It had been 3 years, and she hadn't stopped thinking about them. Now that she was finally reunited with them, this was a very special feeling. Eat it. Meg was also looking at Irina with a gentle expression, but he was feeling a little uneasy. Even though he had made ice cream cake countless times in the test field for the god of cookery, this was the first time he had made it in the real world. Furthermore, he had made it with Amy, so he didn't know if Irina would like it. He didn't know if she liked desserts. Then I'll give it a try. Irina nodded and picked up a spoon. She copied Amy's actions and scooped up a spoonful of cake, which she then slowly put into her mouth. As soon as the cake entered her mouth, Irina's eyes lit up. The strawberry-flavored ice cream melted slowly on the tip of her tongue along with a sweet, milky aroma. The smooth, icy texture was imbued with a sweet flavor. Immediately afterward, the fragrant, creamy mousse cake took the stage. The soft texture was released along with the milky aroma, and it was like the perfect combination of ice and fire, bringing an unparalleled delicious experience to the tip of her tongue. Irina felt as if she had suddenly found a small yellow flower in full bloom on a snowy grassland. That feeling of elation was exactly what she was feeling right now. After swallowing, the strawberry-flavored milky aroma lingered on the tip of her tongue, and she waited for the next mouthful of ice cream. What a delicious dessert! Irina couldn't help but praise. She looked at the cake in her hand, which was missing a corner, and then turned to Ma Chang with a glint in her eyes. Her favorite desserts were all types of desserts. Those desserts exuded a sweet and blissful aroma that could bring her a good mood. Back when she had traveled to the Norland continent, her biggest motivation aside from wanting to explore the outside world was actually to go to other places outside of the wind forest to try other delicacies and desserts. However, after traveling to so many places and tasting all types of desserts, none of them could compare to this small piece of ice cream cake. It turned out that the thing that she had been searching for had always been by her side. Say, you didn't intentionally hide the fact that you could cook from me back then, did you? Irina appraised Meg with an appraising expression. It had only been 3 years since they last met, but he had already created such a delicious dessert. The unique flavor and texture were something that she had never seen before. This is probably what it means to be a natural talent. Meg shrugged, and the smile on his face gradually widened. It appeared that she was very satisfied and fond of this dish. We'll talk more about your natural talent in the future. Irina clearly didn't believe Meg's words, but there was a hint of joy in her eyes. She scooped up another spoonful of ice cream with a blissful smile on her face. Has father and big sister Irina already made a breakthrough? Amy looked at the two of them with a curious expression before blinking at Meg with curiosity in her big blue eyes. However, seeing Anna's expression, she smiled and said, when the boss comes back, the restaurant will be open for business. Aisha will definitely come back. Okay. Anna nodded. Although she was still a little worried, she didn't continue to ask. The three of them were silent for a while. I really want to eat beef kebabs. Barbara broke the silence. I also want to eat Ruggiamo. Yarbemia swallowed her saliva. Anna thought for a while, and said softly, I want to eat Yeongju fried rice. Rumble, someone's stomach growled first. Without roast fish, I'm going to die of boredom. Vivian sat on the rooftop of the city lord's castle. Her long legs dangled outside, and she was a little bored. She supported herself with her hands behind her back and looked up at the sky. Not only did Mr. Mac go to Rodu, he even kidnapped Luna. Now I'm even more bored. After a while, Vivian sighed again with a hint of resentment in her voice. They'll be back the day after tomorrow. Mr. Mac won the Best Dish award at the royal banquet today. A voice with a hint of laughter sounded from below. Vivian looked down to find City Lord Michael standing below with his hands clasped behind his back with a smile on his face. Really? Is Mr. Mac really that good? Vivian jumped down from the rooftop and looked at Michael with incredulity. He had also attended royal banquets in the Roth Empire when he was a child. There were countless tables and chairs in the Grand Palace, and all of them were filled with all types of delicious food. God knew how many chefs were required to cook so many delicious dishes. Among all of them, Mr. Mac's dish was able to stand out and win the Best Dish award. It was simply incredible. But Mr. Mac won the Best Dish award at the royal banquet. Will King Roth keep him in Rodu? Vivian suddenly thought of something, and was a little concerned. If Mr. Mac was kept in Rodu, then she wouldn't be able to eat spicy grilled fish in the future. Her illness had been suppressed by the spicy grilled fish that she had been eating non-stop during this period of time. Even though she had stopped eating spicy grilled fish for a few days, there were no signs of her illness relapsing. According to the doctor, most of the root cause of her illness had already been eradicated. All she had to do now was continue to eat spicy grilled fish, and the root cause of her illness would be completely eradicated. Of course, even if she recovered from her illness, Vivian was afraid that she wouldn't be able to quit eating spicy grilled fish as it was simply too delicious. Michael shook his head with a smile and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Mac rejected King Roth's invitation to stay, and the principal will bring him back. Mr. Mac is a rare talent." "That's good to hear." Wei Wei was immediately relieved. "Young mistress, due to the addition of tailors, the custom-made dresses have basically been completed, and we're in the final stages of refinement. The progress of the other 2 dresses is also faster than expected. According to our calculations, we should be able to order more dresses." The lights in the blue suede were still brightly lit, and Mars quickly strode into Gloria's office as he spoke. "No, the number of dresses won't change, but the quality of all of them has to be guaranteed to be the highest." Gloria thought for a moment before shaking her head. "However, if the tailors have some spare time, we can make more of the other 2 dresses." "All right." Mars nodded with a smile at Gloria before departing. His young mistress was on her way to becoming a successful businesswoman. "Mr. Meg is coming back the day after tomorrow. Perhaps I can ask him some questions. Besides, I'll finally be able to see him again." Gloria rose to her feet and stretched lazily by the window. She couldn't help but blush at the thought of that. "Big Sister Irina, do you want to marry Father after eating this cake?" But this feeling of being teased so openly, as if they were dancing on a string, made him feel a little strange. This was a feeling he had never felt with any woman before. It was obviously a little uncomfortable, but he didn't feel much resistance in his heart. He even felt a little expectant. "Could it be that I'm a masochist?" Meg questioned himself. According to the definition of the word masochist, a masochist is a type of person with masochistic tendencies, the exact opposite of a sadist. According to the system's analysis, the other party's behavior obviously creates pressure and some level of mental abuse for the host. Although the host's body shows a certain degree of resistance, the host is looking forward to it mentally. This behavior pattern only appears when interacting with Irina. According to the system's comprehensive analysis, the host is a hidden masochist, and the host is selective. At this moment, the system's voice sounded in Meg's mind. "System, can't you research something more interesting?" Meg roared in a flustered and exasperated manner. The host's abnormal behavior is an attempt to hide the awkwardness of having his inner thoughts exposed. However, this behavior confirms the system's analysis. "Host, you're a masochist," the system calmly said. Scram. Meg looked at Irina, who was eating the cake, with complicated feelings. Although he was against the system's analysis, he couldn't help but face it head-on. What kind of charm did this woman have to make him behave so strangely? Even though she was already Amy's mother, Irina, who was eating the ice cream cake with an unpretentious smile on her face, was still like a young girl, giving people a sense of youthfulness. Even though she had experienced so many things, you couldn't see the slightest trace of the vicissitudes of life on her face. That kind of vitality and innocence seemed to be infectious, making people unconsciously want to get close to her. Perhaps her beauty was unforgettable, but what Meg saw was an interesting soul, and that was what really interested him. The entire delicious cake was devoured by the 3 of them and the 2 cats. Ugly Duckling rolled over on the ground before slowly inching toward Night. It arrived in front of it, and suddenly got up to pounce on it. Right at this moment, Night suddenly extended a little black paw and pressed it against Ugly Duckling's head. Ugly Duckling immediately cowered. It was pressed to the ground by Night's paw, and it didn't dare to move. It looked at Amy with an aggrieved expression, but didn't dare to cry for help. "This is a very delicious cake." Irina placed the empty plate on the table gently as she looked at Meg. Meg nodded with a smile. It naturally felt very good to be praised. Irina turned to Amy with a smile, and said, "Amy, I'm going to leave Rodu soon. Is there anything you want? I can give it to you as a gift. Anything I want. Amy looked at Irina and thought carefully for a while before saying, Can I have big sister Irina hug me for a while longer? Just like a mother would hug me. Irina looked at Amy, who was staring at her with big, watery eyes, and suddenly felt a lump in her throat. She squatted down and gently picked up Amy in her arms as she said in a gentle voice, I also want to hug you like this every day. Millimeterham, big sister Irina is the best. Amy closed her eyes and inhaled the faint floral fragrance as she lay in Irina's soft and comfortable embrace, and soon fell asleep. In her sleep, the woman under the tree on the moon finally turned around. There was a smile on her exquisitely beautiful face, and she slowly made her way toward her before embracing her in a warm embrace. A smile appeared on Amy's face as she murmured, Mother. Chapter 786. For a split second, Meg had the urge to keep her. Just like that, their family of 3 could live a carefree life, and that seemed pretty good too. Looking at Amy, who was lying in Irina's arms with a smile on her face even in her sleep, he suddenly understood the meaning of the phrase, a family should be complete. He used to think that he could give Amy the most love in the world and let her grow up happily. But he had to admit that motherly love was something that he could never give Amy, and it was also something that she couldn't live without. I'll make sure that the time we spend together becomes shorter. Meg secretly made up his mind. There were many things that needed to be put on the agenda as soon as possible. Irina hugged Amy and gently rocked her back and forth as she hummed a gentle song. It was a soft fairy song, and it sounded like a natural chant. Although they couldn't understand it, it still made their hearts feel at peace. What a wonderful feeling. That ugly little fellow from back then has grown up into a beautiful and mischievous girl. She even knows how to call me mother. Even though she doesn't know who I am, she knows how to get close to me. What a smart little fellow. If only she could stay by your side forever. Irina hugged Amy for a long time. When the singing stopped, she reluctantly looked away from Amy's little face and looked up at Meg. She asked, When will you come and pick me up? Meg looked into Irina's clear eyes and thought seriously for a while before saying firmly, 1 year. Okay, then I'll wait for you for a year. If you don't come and pick me up in a year, then I'll come and pick you up. Irina nodded and handed Amy to Meg. She leaned over and kissed her on the eyes. She looked into Meg's eyes for a long time before suddenly standing on her tiptoes and kissing his cheek. Meg, remember this, you're my man, Irina. A faint golden teleportation formation lit up, and Irina and Knight disappeared at the same time. Only a dumbstruck Meg was left in the room with Amy in his arms, as well as Ugly Duckling, who was also lying on the ground with a dumbstruck expression. Only after a long while did Meg come to his senses. He reached out to touch his cheek and blinked, but he was still a little stunned. When those soft lips were pressed against his cheek, his mind had almost completely gone blank. Even though she didn't say anything threatening, that one sentence was more than countless threats. Meg sighed. It wasn't easy being Irina's man, and from this day onward, he would have to bear this pressure. 1 year was the promise that Meg had made to both Irina and Amy. Meg didn't want to delay their reunion for too long. What he had to do next was to do everything in his power to go to the wind forest to pick up Irina. After all, he didn't want to be picked up by Irina and brought back to the wind forest in a year's time. Living off a woman was a skill, but Meg didn't want to be looked down upon by Amy. He had to ride the rainbow cloud to the wind forest to pick up Irina. Looking at Amy in his arms, Meg's expression gradually softened. As long as she was happy, he would do anything. This is. Meg's gaze landed on a small green string that suddenly appeared on Amy's wrist. There was a green bead about the size of a soybean tied to the string. It also looked like a seed. It was translucent and emitted a faint green light. This bead should have been left behind by Irina. Meg was very familiar with this green light. It was the same light green light that was emitted from Irina's hand when she saved him today. It was full of vitality. Even though I don't know what it is, it must be something precious. Meg pulled Amy's sleeve down a little to cover the bead. Then, he wrapped Amy with his own clothes. Then, he squatted down to pick up Ugly Duckling, who was still lying on the ground, and pushed the door open. The storm had subsided a lot, but the rain was still pouring down heavily. "Master Meg, are you going back? Let me hold an umbrella for you." The butler, who had fallen asleep leaning against the railing, opened his eyes when he heard the sound. When he saw Meg, he quickly went up to him with a smile. "Then I'll have to trouble you." Meg nodded with a smile. He naturally couldn't miss out on such a perfect alibi. Furthermore, he really didn't have the time to hold an umbrella. After exiting the kitchen, he hadn't walked far when a burst of noise sounded from not far away. It was mixed with Josh's scolding and smashing sounds. "What's that?" Meg was a little perplexed. Maybe one of the servants did something wrong. The butler looked in that direction and shrank back. He was secretly glad that he had been given an easy task today, but he didn't dare to say anything. Meg nodded slightly and didn't ask any questions. He was just a little disappointed that he hadn't been able to kill Josh with a single sword strike. After returning to the room, Meg carefully placed Amy on the bed. He looked at the little one's adorable face with a smile, and couldn't help but lean over and kiss her forehead. "Alex is back. Rodu should be in chaos now." Meg looked out the window at the chrysanthemums swaying in the rain. Piss off, all of you." Josh was completely drenched, and his hair was disheveled. He kicked down a servant who was kneeling on the ground with a hot towel in his hands as he yelled at the top of his lungs. Everything in the room was overturned. Precious porcelain bottles and jade stones were smashed into pieces. It was a complete mess as far as the eye could see. The dozen or so servants who were kneeling on the ground hurriedly rushed out of the room as if they had been pardoned. Josh was soon the only one left in the room after the door was closed. Josh staggered over to the table and supported himself with both hands as he sat down in a chair in a daze with a hollow look in his eyes. Right at this moment, a burst of blue light lit up in the room, and Richard emerged from the teleportation formation. His brows furrowed slightly at the sight of Josh, who was sitting there as if his soul had been sucked out of his body. He said in a grim voice, "Your Highness, Alex has reappeared, and he's at the peak of his powers. If he reveals what happened 3 years ago to the public, we're going to be under immense pressure. We have to make some preparations." Josh only came to his senses after hearing that voice. He looked at Richard, and his lips trembled as his face paled slightly. He wanted to kill me. His sword slashed across my neck, and I almost died." Richard took a glance at the wound on Josh's neck, and a serious expression appeared on his face as he said, "Your Highness, we'll protect you." Chapter 787. In a spacious courtyard to the west of Rodu, a golden teleportation spell formation appeared, and Irina slowly made her way out of it. A few lights were lit up in the inky black room, and soon, several elves emerged from their rooms with wary expressions. All of them were surprised to see Irina, and they hurriedly extended respectful salutes. "Your Highness, I need to use the teleportation spell formation to return to the Wind Forest." Irina looked at the white-haired old elf with a calm expression. The battle outside the Wind Forest was drawing to a conclusion. A massive icicle was impaled into the chest of a tall demon, pinning him to a large tree. At the same time, Sally, who was standing on a tree branch in the distance, was also struck in the stomach by half a shield, and she fell from the tree branch with a dull thump. Blower had a broken sword embedded in his chest, and he was stumbling toward Sally. Blood was gushing out of his wounds, and his pale face appeared to be extremely feeble, as if he were going to collapse at any moment. However, he still continued to make his way toward Sally with determination. A dozen or so demon and orc corpses were strewn all over the ground, and the elves who had their hands and feet bound were squatting on the ground with horrified expressions. They leaned against each other with their heads bowed, and there were even children sobbing. Ever since they had been captured by these people, they had been subjected to countless torments. They knew that this kind of torture wouldn't stop after coming to the Wind Forest. Instead, it would only intensify. Being tortured by elves was even more torturous than being tortured by demons and orcs. However, their escort team had already arrived outside the Wind Forest, so how had they suddenly been ambushed? They were only suffering because of their brethren, so none of them dared to hope that someone would save them. They're all dead. An elf exclaimed in shock as he removed the rag from his mouth. All of the elves raised their heads upon hearing that, and their eyes immediately lit up at the sight of their most hated enemies lying in pools of blood. Could it be that they're here to save us? The elf from before looked at the motionless Sally and the struggling Blower with a perplexed expression. If they were the elves responsible for the trade, they definitely wouldn't attack these orcs and demons, nor would they risk their lives to ambush them. Are you still alive? Blower panted heavily as he leaned against a tree for support. He looked at Sally, who was lying on the ground with blood dripping from the corners of her lips. Cough. Cough, cough. Sally, who had been lying on the ground this entire time, suddenly coughed violently as she sat up, and threw up a mouthful of blood. She then turned to Blower with furrowed brows, and feebly asked, "Are you a man or a woman? Is that important?" Blower rolled his eyes, but he was quite relieved to see that Sally wasn't going to die from this ordeal. He heaved a sigh of relief, and his feeble body finally gave out as he sat down onto the ground. The wound on his chest had been torn open, and even more blood was flowing out. His brows furrowed tightly with pain. A streak of green light appeared on Sally's fingertips, and she gently rubbed it over her lower abdomen. The wound caused by the shield stopped bleeding. Her internal injuries couldn't be healed in a short period of time, but it was enough for her to move normally. Sally slowly stood up and made her way over to Blower as she said, "If you were a woman, then I wouldn't have to think of a way to annul the engagement." Blower looked up at Sally, and forced a smile onto his face as he said, "You don't have to worry about that, I don't have any feelings for you." "Very good." Sally nodded before grabbing onto the broken sword embedded in Blower's chest. "What are you doing?" Blower's voice suddenly rose an octave. "I'm going to pull it out for you," Sally replied in an indifferent voice. "You're going to kill me if you pull it out like that." A hint of horror appeared in Blower's eyes. This woman was way too terrifying. Could it be that he had hurt her with his words? "Well, I actually think you're a pretty good woman. It's just that I'm not interested in the Wind Forest." "Ah." Before Blower had a chance to finish his sentence, a sharp cry erupted, scaring away all of the birds that had just landed nearby. Blower looked down at the frozen wound on his chest, and the wisps of green light that were seeping into the wound. His face was still as pale as a sheet of paper from extreme shock. "Is this woman a demon?" Blower looked up at the expressionless Sally, and his heart shuddered. Even though he had been saved, he still instinctively wanted to distance himself from her. Not only was this woman capable of accurate swordsmanship and powerful magic, she was also capable of killing without batting an eyelid. "If you don't want to be taken back like this, then eat this and get ready to go." Sally tossed her blood-stained broken sword to the side, and a gentle wash of water flowed over her hand. She flipped her hand over to produce a small green box, and poured out a small green pill from within before handing it to Blower. "All right." Blower looked down at himself before popping the small pill into his mouth. He then propped himself up against a tree beside him. Even though they had ambushed the escort team outside the Wind Forest, the elves who had been waiting for the escort team to arrive were most likely going to get here very soon. If he were to be taken back while dressed as a woman, he would most likely have his legs broken by his father. Sally made her way over to the elves. She raised a hand, and a small ice blade sliced through the elves, slicing through the vines and magic binding ropes binding them. She looked at the elves, and said in a gentle voice, "Don't be afraid, we're here to save you." After regaining their freedom, the elves pulled out the rags that had been stuffed into their mouths. They looked down at their hands, which were no longer bound. The vines had almost sunk into their flesh, leaving behind 2 deep gashes. After a moment of silence, some of the elves suddenly began to sob. The sobbing became louder and louder, and almost all of the elves were weeping. The smile on Sally's face gradually disappeared. She looked at the sobbing elves, and felt as if her heart had been constricted. She had once thought that the Wind Forest was the most perfect place in the world, and that all of the elves who lived there lived carefree lives. They enjoyed the service of their elven servants, and they felt that they were all happy as well. However, all of that had now been shattered, as if a beautiful crystal window had been shattered by a hammer, revealing all of the filth behind it. It was a ghastly sight. Blower stood beside Sally with a complex expression on his face. However, he still yelled, "Let's go, it's time for us to go." The sobbing of the elves gradually subsided, and they bowed deeply to Blower and Sally. They took one last look at the wind forest, which they had once viewed as a holy land, but now it had become a living hell that they didn't dare to take even a single step into, and they began to depart in the opposite direction. "How dare you!" Chapter 788. Within the darkness, several tens of black-robed elves surrounded them, pointing their sharp arrows at Sally, Blower, and the other elves. The leader of the group was a middle-aged elf with a square face. Compared to the elves who were generally more handsome, this elf was quite eye-catching. He swept his sharp gaze over the corpses on the ground and the terrified elves before finally settling on Sally and Blower. The elf on the left was a little disheveled, but her tattered dress still couldn't hide her beauty. However, he didn't recall seeing such a beautiful young girl among the elves. The elf on the right had a black veil over her face, so he couldn't see her features clearly in the darkness, but judging from her figure and eyes, she was most likely a young girl as well. There were many orc and demon corpses on the ground, and many of them were at the 6th or 7th tier. They were the first batch of elves to be escorted here, but they were all killed. From the looks of it, these two young girls were most likely responsible. Seeing as they weren't elves from the wind forest, and dared to ambush the escorts, these two had to be one of those so-called free elves who dared to do something so audacious. But these two young girls are quite beautiful and have great figures. If I give them to Master Boris, he'll definitely like them. Colby looked at Sally and Blower. They appeared to have been injured in the previous battle, so this was a good opportunity to capture them. He waved a hand and said, "Capture them. Kill anyone who dares to resist." Despair appeared on the faces of the elves who had just regained their freedom. They looked at the menacing arrows, and couldn't muster up any thoughts of resistance. They stood rooted to the spot, waiting for their brethren to tie them up again and enslave them. Colby, an 8th-tier wood-type magic caster. "I can't beat him, but I'll try my best to hold him off." "You take as many as you can," Blower said softly to Colby. "I'll hold him off, and you take them away." Sally, who had put on her black veil, turned to Blower, and said, "If you're captured like this, the news that the third young master of the Bybilly family is a freak will spread throughout the entire the Wind Forest tomorrow. I am who I am. I am not a pervert, and I will not change because of what others say." A smile appeared on Blower's face as he looked at Sally. "But you could be the future hope of the elven race, the hope of freedom." As soon as he said that, the seemingly feeble Blower suddenly burst forth with astonishing speed and power as he dashed toward Colby. Light glowed on his wand, and it transformed into a series of wooden arrows that flew toward Colby. "Heh, you still dare to attack me?" Colby looked at Blower with disdain. He raised his hand, and a thick wooden shield appeared in front of him. The wooden arrows landed on the wooden shield, but they didn't cause any damage to it. As Blower continued onward, the branches of the surrounding trees seemed to have sprung to life as they lashed toward Blower like whips. They were traveling at an astonishing speed, and the sound of the air being torn apart rang out as they flew through the air. Countless vines extended from beneath Colby's feet toward Blower and the other elves like a swarm of green vipers. Sally took a glance at Blower, and for the first time, a different light appeared in her eyes. She stepped onto a nearby tree trunk, and her agile body traversed through the forest like a cheetah. She picked up two little elves from the group of elves on either side of her, then turned around and ran in the opposite direction. "Don't let her get away. Fire the arrows." An elf yelled as a series of arrows rained down toward Sally's back. Sally darted through the trees like an elf, and the arrows barely passed by her before embedding themselves deeply into the tree trunks. However, her speed was clearly slowing down. The two little elves that she was carrying looked at her with horror on their faces, but they didn't cry. Whoosh! A flaming arrow hurtled through the air, but its target wasn't Sally. Instead, it was the little elf that she was carrying in her left hand. Elves were a race that excelled at hunting, and they had all mastered superb archery techniques. This arrow was more powerful and faster than the previous ones, and it was able to accurately determine Sally's trajectory. Sally's expression immediately changed. This was clearly a seasoned hunter who had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to unleash a lethal attack. His footsteps were forced to stop, and the foot that landed on the tree trunk forced his body to turn sideways as he moved forward, changing the position of the little elf. The arrow whistled through the air, leaving a deep gash in her back. It then pierced through 3 trees in quick succession before embedding itself into the 4th one. The immense force imbued within the arrow made Sally stumble, and she almost fell to the ground. The barrage of arrows that were hurtling toward her made it impossible for her to continue onward. The elves slowly surrounded her, and the wands in their hands began to glow. There was no lack of 6th and 7th tier magic casters among them. "I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I won't be able to take you with me today." Sally stopped in her tracks and gently placed the 2 little elves onto the ground. Tears shone in her eyes as she gripped her wand tightly. The little elf girl extended her little hand and touched Sally's hand. She looked up with a serious expression, and said, "Big sister killed the bad guys who killed our parents. Thank you. They killed my grandpa. Thank you." The little elf boy also looked up with gratitude. Sally looked down at the 2 little elves, and her tears began to flow down her cheeks uncontrollably. Blower had evaded many branches, and unleashed an advanced spell with all his might, but he was still unable to break through Kobol's defenses. He was bound tightly by the vines, and hung upside down from a large tree. The elves were also bound by the vines, and their eyes were filled with despair. They didn't struggle, nor did they cry. It was as if they had already died. The barrage of spells was blocked by Sally's magic barrier. However, the magic barrier that was getting thinner and thinner still couldn't withstand the barrage of attacks. After it was destroyed, the exhausted Sally and the 2 little elves were also bound by the vines, and dragged into the midst of the elves. Kobol walked forward, and looked down at the elves with a condescending expression as he said, "All of you were born to be inferior to the elves in the crazy forest, and are destined to become slaves. If you dare to resist, only death awaits you. There are classes in this world, and all of you belong to the lowest class." The elves held Kobol down with hatred in their eyes, but more than that, they were resigned to their fate and in despair. In this world, no one could save them because all the elves in the forest had silently agreed to this, including the Elven Queen. "Who's farting here?" Chapter 789. It wasn't always a pie that fell from the sky, it could also be a beautiful elf. Just as all of the captured elves were in despair, and Sally and Blower were doing their best to turn the tables, a figure descended from the sky and stomped the arrogant Colby into the ground. This was an exquisitely beautiful elf in a white robe. There was a small golden crescent moon on her glabella, and a faint golden light enshrouded her body. She was like a goddess who had descended from the heavens, striking onlookers with a sense of holiness. However, such a beautiful elf was stomping on Colby's face. Colby, who was an 8th tier wood-type magic caster and had easily subdued Blower and all of the other elves, had half of his face stomped into the ground, and was completely immobilized. Could it be that she's here to save us? This scene was like a miracle in the eyes of all of the captured elves. They almost couldn't believe their eyes, and a hint of hope reappeared in their hearts. "Your Highness." Blower's eyes lit up, and he immediately heaved a sigh of relief. As long as she was here, everything would be fine. "Princess Irina." Sally's eyes also lit up at the sight of the elf who had suddenly descended from the sky, and a smile appeared on her tear-stained face. In the wind forest, she was the only one they could rely on and trust. They just didn't think that she would really appear. The elf who had descended from the sky was Irina, who had just teleported back from Rodu. The teleportation spell formation of the Elven Embassy in Rodu required a large amount of spirit stones to activate, so it was rarely used. However, with Irina's status, it was naturally no issue for her to use it once. "Your Highness." All of the surrounding elves were shocked to see who had arrived, and all of them lowered their heads in salute toward Irina. They also hurriedly lowered the boughs in their hands with nervous expressions. Just a few months ago, the princess came out of seclusion again, and killed Elder Hubert on the spot because of the elven slaves. The queen also issued a new order to ban all slaves and release the elves who wanted to leave the wind forest. But after that, Princess Irina was imprisoned again, and Her Majesty the Queen was also in seclusion. She didn't really manage the affairs of the clan. Therefore, after symbolically releasing some old, weak, sick, and disabled slaves, the major families didn't really carry out the law. As winter approached, more and more elves would be sent to the wind forest to supply the major families with fresh slaves and provide the border with young cannon fodder. All of the major families in the elven race were extremely powerful, and even with Schubert's example, all of them were still doing business with one another. However, that didn't mean that no one dared to ignore Irina. After all, she had dared to kill Schubert right in front of Mistress Helena and the Queen. Regardless of whether it was her power or her merciless personality, none of the major families dared to provoke her. Furthermore, the timing of this transaction just so happened to coincide with her trip to Rodu to celebrate the birthday of the king of the Roth Empire. According to the plan, she should still be in Rodu, but who would have thought that she would appear here? Horror began to well up in their hearts. Your Highness. The bound elves faltered slightly upon hearing this, and they suddenly recalled some legends about Princess Irina. In this world, if there was one elf from the Wind Forest who was sympathetic toward them, then it had to be that kind-hearted princess. A few years ago, Princess Irina, who had traveled the continent with Alex, had almost wiped out all of the orc and demon mercenary squads that targeted wandering elves. Even those who had survived all gave up on attacking elves in fear that Princess Irina would come looking for them. Those were the safest years for wandering elves on the Norland continent. They didn't have to worry about demons and orcs suddenly appearing and capturing them. Even though not all elves had been saved by Princess Irina, all of them were grateful for everything she had done for them. She was like a savior who had saved them from the abyss of suffering. However, good times didn't last long. 3 years ago, Princess Irina stopped appearing, and the demons and orcs that were lurking in the shadows once again reached out their claws. The elves who resisted were killed, and the beautiful elves would become the slaves of some powerful beings on Rodu or Demon Island. Even more elves were sent back to the Wind Forest as lowly slaves. This was a never-ending disaster. Aside from a few powerful elves who had managed to escape, almost all of the elves scattered across the Norland continent had been killed. Only Chaos City had become the last safe haven for the free elves. However, in recent years, even the elves in Chaos City had begun to disappear from time to time. The elves were almost completely powerless in this disaster, and most of them had placed their hopes on Princess Irina. However, there had been no news of her since 3 years ago, and the elves were becoming more and more despaired. However, Princess Irina had appeared again, and stomped all of the elves who had attacked them into the ground in an extremely domineering manner. Hope reappeared in the elves' despairing eyes. If there was someone in this world who could save them from the Wind Forest, then it had to be Princess Irina. Elves are born equal. Who says they are inferior? Irina glanced at all the elves present before looking down at Colby, who had been stomped into the ground by her. She coldly said, "The Queen abolished the slave system a month ago. Who gave you the guts to continue colluding with these bastards to kidnap your own kind?" "Your Highness. I was only following orders." This was all Elder Difference orders, Colby said with difficulty and fear as half of his face was sunk into the ground. Even Hubert's elder Irina dared to kill him on the spot. It would be very normal for her to kill him on the spot. He had only lived for less than half of the elves' long lifespan, and didn't want to die just like that. "Very well, I'll get even with him for this." Irina nodded coldly. She raised her right foot and stomped down again. Colby's head was completely sunk into the ground. He kicked his legs, and stopped moving. Chapter 790. She's back. In the starry cave abode, Helena looked toward the northwest with a hint of surprise in her eyes. However, she also heaved a sigh of relief. Then, she seemed to have thought of something, and her brows furrowed again. After pondering for a while, she shook her head and murmured to herself, "Those pieces of trash, Irina, it's good that you're all right." A smile appeared on the Elven Queen's face as she stood on the largest tree. She looked toward the northwest, and the smile on her face gradually disappeared. Perhaps I should let her go and do something. Perhaps I really did make a mistake back then. The Elven Queen stood on the tree for a long time before withdrawing her gaze. She slowly walked down the tree and disappeared into the tree hole. Irina is back. At the same time, some of the elves sensed the magic waves coming from outside the forest. Such powerful teleportation magic had already made some people guess who had returned. Many of them knew what was going to happen outside the wind forest today, and some of them were even the masterminds. However, Irina, who everyone thought would be trapped in Rodu forever, suddenly returned to the wind forest. This was undoubtedly beyond everyone's expectations. There were already elves gathering in the darkness. Aside from horror, the elves who were holding longbows also had a hint of shame on their faces. They lowered their heads and didn't dare to look at Irina directly. "Please spare us, princess. We were only following orders." The longbow in one of the elves' hands fell to the ground, and he immediately knelt to the ground. "Please spare us, princess." All of the elves knelt to the ground with fearful expressions. Irina swept her gaze across those elves, and the vines binding the elves in the center retreated. Then, the vines wrapped around those elves and tied them to the trees. Those elves who had regained their freedom sat on the ground, paralyzed. Regardless of whether it was Colby who had been killed on the spot or the elven warriors who had been tied up, everything was like a dream. They couldn't believe it. "I am Irina." Irina took 2 steps forward, and a look of pity appeared on her face as she looked at the elves who were riddled with wounds. She raised her hand gently, and a beam of green light rose up from the tree of life in the distance. The beam of green light surged toward her and circled around her body before flowing into the crowd of elves like a stream of water. Light green light brushed over the wounds of the elves, and the life force caused those wounds to quickly heal. Their bodies, which were almost skin and bones due to starvation and abuse, also recovered. Their pale faces regained some color, and their empty eyes seemed to have regained some luster due to the changes in their bodies. In the blink of an eye, all of the elves had received excellent treatment, as if they had been given a new lease of life. "Thank you, Your Highness." "Thank you." Elation appeared on the faces of the elves as they sensed the changes in their bodies. They bowed to Irina with tears of gratitude in their eyes. The 2 little elves in Sally's arms blushed slightly as they stood up from Sally's arms. They each extended a little hand to help Sally up, and elated smiles appeared on their little faces as they said, "Big sister, Her Highness is here to save us." "Yes, Her Highness saved us." Sally nodded as she looked at Irina with reverence in her eyes. "In the future, I'm going to become an elf like you and fight for all elves." "Sure, can you put me down first?" Blower asked in a quiet voice. Even though he had also been treated, he was still hanging from the tree, and it was a little awkward for him. Sally raised a finger, and a blade of ice sliced through the vines on Blower's body. Blower fell from the tree, and just barely managed to land on his knees before his head hit the ground. He then knelt down in front of Irina. "There's no need to thank me. I only did what I had to do." Irina shook her head. She looked at Blower, then at Sally, and nodded as she said, "Go on. Go to Chaos City. That's the only safe place now. Someone will take you there, and no one will chase you down." Blower stood up with an awkward expression, and he couldn't help but rub his own knees. He took a glance at Irina before turning around, and yelling, "Come with me, everyone, I'll take you to Chaos City." The elves bowed to Irina with gratitude in their eyes again before following Blower south. Chaos City was an unfamiliar place to them, but it was indeed their last safe haven. At the very least, no mercenary squad would dare to openly capture elves there. Sally looked at Irina, and her mouth gaped open, but she refrained from saying anything in the end. She took one final glance at Irina before quickly following the group. Irina's promise meant that they would be able to safely take these elves back to Chaos City. If she said that no one would chase them down, then no one would dare to chase them down. The group of several dozen elves traversed through the inky black forest. Blower was leading the way with a torch in his hand, illuminating the dark path ahead. All of the elves' eyes were filled with hope. It was as if they had finally found a path to sunlight in the boundless darkness. Irina looked on as the torch disappeared into the depths of the forest. She then slowly turned to look in the direction of the wind forest, and stood there in silence. The wind forest was also completely silent, as if no one knew what was going on outside. That night, Countless people on the Norland continent were unable to sleep. However, Meg slept very well. When he opened his eyes, the warm morning sun shone through the unlatched window onto his bed. It was as if the storm from the night before had been nothing more than a dream. He turned to look at Amy, who was sleeping soundly in his arms, and a smile appeared on Meg's face. As long as he could see Amy's smile every day when he woke up, everything would be fine. After Amy woke up naturally, Meg got up and helped her into a beautiful white dress. "Father, where's big sister Irina? Has she already left?" Amy looked around with a hint of disappointment on her little face. "Yes. She left after putting Amy to sleep last night. We'll see her again in the future." Meg smiled as he patted Amy's head. "I thought she would stay the night here." Amy heaved a forlorn sigh. She looked up at Meg and scolded him like a little adult. "Father, why didn't you seize the opportunity?" Meg's expression darkened upon hearing this. What was going on in this little girl's head? Was she trying to help her parents? "All right, we have to go and participate in today's decimal system debate competition. Teacher Luna is going to be very worried." Meg changed the subject as he held Amy's little hand and led her out the door. "Father, when will we be able to see big sister Irina again?" Amy asked as she raised her head. Chapter 791. A new day had arrived in Rodu, and many people were beginning to reassess the situation due to Alex's appearance. Even though the details of the battle the night before hadn't been revealed, the fact that the second prince had just so happened to appear at the scene was still quite intriguing. Back when news of Alex's assassination spread, the king had personally announced the cause of his death, and executed several orcs and demons, but there were still many conspiracy theories about him. Alex had reappeared the night before, and Josh just so happened to be related to him. There were even rumors that he had sparred with Alex, so this was naturally very intriguing news. There was already a delicate balance between Josh and Sean, and as long as the king didn't express his stance, it would be very difficult for this balance to be broken in the short term. However, Alex's appearance was like a sharp sword that mercilessly tore apart this pretense of peace. With his immense power and status in the hearts of the Roth Empire's citizens, his choice would undoubtedly break this delicate balance, and even King Edward couldn't ignore his opinion. Regardless of whether Alex had anything to do with the incident 3 years ago, most people didn't think that he would choose Josh after his return. Sean, who had once fought alongside him on the border, was clearly a better choice. After news of Alex's death spread, the first prince had personally stood in front of his coffin for 3 days and 3 nights, which was a clear indication of the deep friendship between the two of them. All of the officials who had already made their choice began to consider whether they had made the wrong decision, and the fence-sitters seemed to have found a clear direction to take, and were beginning to stir. The heavy downpour the night before was destined to shake the entire Roth Empire. Of course, there were some people who weren't affected by this, such as the normal citizens on the streets who were still debating what to eat for breakfast, or the high-spirited scholars who were making their way to Carlow Church. Carlow Church was located in the western part of Rodu. Black railings surrounded an extremely wide plot of land, and at the center of the yellowing lawn was a grand, domed church. 2 rows of large white stone pillars were arranged in an orderly fashion, and on the white flagstone plaza, white pigeons were searching for grass seeds between the cracks in the stone. A black-robed preacher wore a serious expression as he walked through the corridors of the church. Instead of a smile, he seemed to be in a hurry. The history of the church was even longer than that of the Roth Empire. During the war among species, the preachers roamed the Norland continent, healing those who had been injured during the war, and raising and protecting those children who had lost their parents during the war. They were deeply revered and worshipped by the humans. During the war among species, the church was one of the leaders of the human side. They were the ones who had gradually united the humans, and used the church as an organization to nurture many knights and magic casters for the human race. The Roth Empire be the royal family, and the royal family to the 2 to lead to the humans to the war. However, after the Roth Empire was established, the successive kings had been intentionally or unintentionally weakening the church's influence and control over the royal family. This was especially evident during the past few decades that Endre had been in power. Carlow Church was the only church left in the Roth Empire, and most of the church's influence had been absorbed by the Magus Tower. All of the people who had survived the war had already died, and aside from some believers, this century-old church was now more like a symbol of the church's existence in human history. Even though the Pope was still nominally respected by the empire's royal family, there were extremely strict restrictions on preaching, so the church had essentially become a mere figurehead. The empty Carlow Church had even become a venue for some of the ministers to hold large-scale events. For example, this debate was being held in Carlow Church. The elderly preacher naturally didn't have to attend to such matters, so he stayed in the room at the back of the church. Even though the church was on the decline, it couldn't be bullied by just anyone. The Roth Empire's Ministry of Education had only borrowed the church's main hall, and couldn't access the rest of the church as they pleased. The young preacher served tea to these white-robed scholars with a serious expression before standing off to the side with his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't want these people to disturb the peace of the church, but he had no choice but to serve them, so his expression naturally wasn't very pleasant. The entire hall was paved with glossy golden marble, and light shone through the amber crystal dome, illuminating the entire hall. There were intricate murals carved onto the stone walls, most of which depicted how the church had saved the human race during the war among species. During that war-torn era, it was these preachers who had led the human race out of the Dark Age and established a true foothold on the Norland continent. Beneath these murals were hundreds of people in white and green robes sitting with their legs crossed. Some of them already had white hair, while others were still in their prime. There were clearly fewer people in green robes, and they were even younger. On the platform, there were 10 people sitting with their legs crossed, and half of them were in green robes while the other half was in white robes. All of the people in white robes were elderly men with white hair. In contrast, aside from Byron, who was sitting at the very center, the other 4 people in green robes were only middle-aged, and there was a young man who appeared to be around 30 years of age. All of the people in green robes wore nervous expressions as they turned to look at Byron from time to time. This was the last of the 10 debates, and the outcome of this debate would determine whether the Roth Empire would adopt the new system of arithmetic or continue to use the old hexadecimal system. Judging from the previous 9 matches, even though more and more factions were joining the Xingyi faction, the Xingyi reformists were still on the decline compared to the stubborn conservative faction. Furthermore, it was very difficult for the Xingyi faction to launch a powerful counterattack to break through the Xingyi faction's defense after the Xingyi faction accused them of being traditional and inherited. If they were to lose this debate, then all of their efforts during this period would go to waste. Furthermore, the multiplication table that had given them hope of popularizing arithmetic would also go to waste, and that was something that no one wanted to see happen. Master Byron, it's already 9 a.m., let's begin the debate. A middle-aged man in a black robe stepped forward as he looked at Byron. Why aren't Mr. Meg and the others here yet? Luna was standing at the entrance of the hall, and she was looking toward the entrance of the church with an anxious expression. Byron also took a glance at the entrance before withdrawing his gaze as he nodded, and said, "Let's begin. Father, should we have noodles or rice for breakfast?" Chapter 792. As soon as the time was up, the debate began. This debate, which had been going on for 2 months, had started off with daggers drawn and bows drawn. Soon, it entered a white-hot state. The hexadecimal system is a precious legacy left to us by our ancestors. It is the culmination of the wisdom of our ancestors, and it has played an extremely important role in our history for thousands of years. It has even affected the reproduction and survival of the human race. As such, countless mathematicians have worked tirelessly to develop and expand this field of study, thereby allowing it to reach its current height. This is the brightest star in the history of the human race. It is the result of the combined efforts of all of the greatest mathematicians in human history, and it will continue to guide the human race forward. However, all of you are now trying to replace it with a low-level algorithm, thereby giving up all of the work of your ancestors. What a foolish act. Elmer was sitting in the center of the conservative faction, and he had a large black mole on his glabella as he appraised Byron and the others with a sense of superiority in his voice. The conservative faction nodded in unison, and all of them were looking at the reformists with disdain in their eyes. They didn't know why these guys were following Byron's lead. They were trying to reform the hexadecimal system, and they were even making such a big fuss about it. The decimal system was only used for currency in the Roth Empire, and the mathematics world had always scoffed at it. They felt that such a crude algorithm was beneath them to be studied. If it weren't for the fact that currency was widely used on the entire Norland continent, the decimal system wouldn't have been introduced in the Roth Empire. Byron was the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Education, and he held the highest status among all of the people present. However, even with his status, it was still very difficult for him to implement the decimal system. This was a clear indication of just how deeply rooted the hexadecimal system was in the mathematics world of the Roth Empire. This incident had become the laughingstock of the entire academic community in the Roth Empire. Master Byron was a highly respected figure in the academic community, and he was nearing retirement age. If he were to do something like this, he would most likely become the laughingstock of the entire academic community. The decimal system is far more concise and efficient than the hexadecimal system. Combined with the Mammy multiplication table, the calculation efficiency will be increased by countless times. This is undoubtedly an advantage that the hexadecimal system has over the hexadecimal system. If we can replace the hexadecimal system with the decimal system, and popularize the Mammy multiplication table, we'll be able to greatly increase the intelligence of the populace. We'll be able to popularize arithmetic, and even allow all commoners to learn arithmetic. Liszt, the youngest scholar of the reformists, said with excitement. A blueprint seemed to have been unfolded in front of him. Commoners. Heh. Roy, who was sitting beside Irma, pursed his lips in disdain. Do you think those lowly and foolish commoners have the right to learn something as noble as arithmetic? Mathematics is a noble art exclusive to the nobles. What we should do is to let those ignorant people continue to be stupid. Who allowed you to raise the intelligence of the people? The more those ignorant commoners know, the more ideas they'll have, and that's not a good thing. Liszt's expression changed slightly as he slowly clenched his fists. He was born in a fallen noble family, and had entered the Bohemia Academy with outstanding results. With his astonishing aptitude in arithmetic, he had already become a professor at the Bohemia Academy at the age of 30, and was the youngest professor in the Bohemia Academy. When he was very young, his gambling addict grandfather had lost his entire manor. As such, he had lived with his father and mother in a normal residential area in the northern part of Rodu, living a life that was no different from that of a normal commoner. He had many playmates among the commoners. As such, in his heart, commoners were no better than his enemies. However, the nobles' system restricted their development, and they were unable to enter a noble school. Just as Roy had said, the education system in the Roth Empire could only be described as the education for the ignorant. The nobles received the best education to become more outstanding elites, while the commoners had no right to receive an education. They lived in ignorance for generations. Liszt was also aware that the commoners had to work hard to fill their stomachs every day, so they didn't have any extra money or spare time to receive an education. However, if the decimal system could replace the hexadecimal system, and the Mammy multiplication table could be popularized, then even the commoners would be able to quickly master all arithmetic up to 10. That would be enough for them to use in their daily lives. Quantitative change was bound to bring about qualitative change. Once enough commoners mastered the decimal system, it would definitely be a significant boost for the entire human race. Mathematics wasn't an art that only a minority of people pretended to be elegant. It was a tool that should be used in daily life and production. However, he just couldn't convince these esteemed masters of the Roth Empire to do so. Byron looked at Roy, and said in a serious voice, "The education system we're doing isn't education for the ignorant commoners. The nobles' education system has been popular for many years. What we're going to do next is to select some talented children from the commoners and educate them so that they can become pillars of the Roth Empire." Commoners have the blood of fools flowing through their veins. Even if we give them an opportunity to learn, they still won't be able to become pillars of the Roth Empire. Our Mathematics Association has already voted yesterday, and over 90% of our members are against the decimal system reform. They want to preserve the hexadecimal system, and that's the attitude and determination of the entire mathematics community. On top of that, this so-called multiplication table proposed by a nobody that hasn't even been tested and verified yet dares to challenge the hexadecimal system that we've been adhering to for thousands of years. If we were to change it, wouldn't we become the laughingstock of the entire continent? If the Roth Empire's mathematics heritage were to be destroyed, would you be able to bear the responsibility? Elton chuckled coldly as he glowered at the reformists. The reformist party fell silent as everyone turned to look at Byron. Only Lord Byron had the right to bear such a heavy burden. Even he most likely wouldn't be able to bear such a heavy burden. Luna was standing at the entrance of the palace with her hands clasped together as she looked at Byron with an anxious expression. This was a trap that Elton had set up, but regardless of whether Byron jumped into it or not, he was destined to lose. Smiles appeared on the faces of Irma and the others, as if they had already foreseen this outcome. "Sorry, I'm late." Right at this moment, the door of the palace was suddenly pushed open from the outside. Chapter 793. The debate had already reached the climax, and no one dared to answer Elton's sharp questions. If the revolutionaries couldn't come up with a response, then the conservative faction would emerge victorious. However, right at this moment, someone suddenly barged into the venue. Everyone turned to look at the strange duo at the entrance. The short-haired young man and the half-elf girl didn't seem to have anything to do with this debate, so they were even more perplexed as to why they were here. "Who is he?" Elton glowered at Meg with a cold expression. If he could end this debate with a single sentence, then his reputation in the academic world would definitely skyrocket. As such, he was naturally not in a good mood to be interrupted at such a crucial moment. "Is he the chef from the royal banquet yesterday?" Irma faltered slightly at the sight of the father and daughter duo standing at the entrance. He had also attended the royal banquet the day before, so he naturally still remembered this pair of father and daughter. However, he didn't think that he would see them here again. Could it be that the debate was going to provide free meals? Did they invite him here to cook for them? That's right. Why is he here instead of cooking for His Majesty? Roy looked at Meg with furrowed brows. The revolutionaries were also quite perplexed as they didn't know who this intruder was. "Teacher Luna." Amy hugged Ugly Duckling a little tighter as she greeted Luna with a smile. "Amy, Mr. Meg." A faint smile appeared on Luna's nervous face. Even though he was a little late, Meg had still arrived, and the debate wasn't over yet. "My apologies, I was delayed on the way here." Meg nodded in an apologetic manner. He wasn't the one who had made the breakfast, so it was a little difficult for him to choose. He had always been a punctual person. "Mr. Meg, this way please." Byron rose to his feet with a smile on his face. "All right." Meg gestured for Amy to stand beside Luna while he made his way over to Byron. Eldon said unhappily, "Lord Byron, what do you mean?" The head-to-head battle was still in progress, so how could they allow irrelevant people to interrupt? What's more, he's a chef who doesn't even know how to count. Do you want a chef to come on stage and debate for you? The people from the conservative faction burst into laughter. They looked at Meg with disdain. How could a chef know how to count? Then wouldn't they be the same as chefs? Not only is Mr. Meg the chef who won the Best Dish award, but he's also the one who came up with the Mammy multiplication table. It's exactly because of his exceptional research that it's so easy to popularize arithmetic, and that's why this debate is taking place. Byron looked at Mag with a hint of approval in his eyes as he said, "How can you say that he has nothing to do with this?" Among the people present, who was more qualified than him to sit here? Today, he is our sixth debater. Is he the Mr. Meg who came up with the Mammy multiplication table? List's eyes lit up. The simple and catchy formula was imbued with astonishing wisdom. He had thought that the person who could come up with such an intricate formula had to be an elderly and wise scholar, but who would have thought that it would be a young man who was around his age? The people of the reformists were also shocked to hear this. If it weren't for the fact that they were amazed by the ingenuity of Mammy's multiplication table, which almost overturned their understanding of mathematics, they wouldn't have switched to the decimal system camp in such a short time and attempted to reform the system as rebels. Furthermore, the person who had come up with such an intricate formula was so young, and he was also a chef. The fact that Byron was praising Mag in such a manner made everyone reassess him in a new light. The fact that he had won the Best Dish award at the palace banquet indicated that his skills as a chef were already at the pinnacle of the world. What kind of mathematical prowess did a chef like him possess? Earlton looked at Meg with a mocking expression, and said, "No wonder your so-called multiplication table is so crude, it was created by a chef. Looks like I overestimated this formula. If I had known that this was a slobbering song that a chef came up with in the kitchen, I definitely wouldn't have participated in this debate." The Conservative Party also showed a sense of superiority on their faces. They were born as nobles, and as scholars, they naturally had a sense of superiority. Even if they were facing an ordinary noble, they would feel superior to them, let alone a vulgar chef. Even the people on the reformist side looked a little unnatural. Byron hadn't revealed much about Meg, so they didn't even know his age, let alone what his occupation was. For people like them who had already established a foothold in the academic world, it was inevitable that they would find it absurd to work so hard for a formula proposed by a chef. Catchiness is the basis for widespread dissemination. For basic education, this means that it can be infinitely replicated and quickly popularized. Meg stopped in front of the stage and looked at Earlton with a smile as he said, "Basic mathematics is a practical subject, it's not some pretentious art. If you try to study two-digit multiplication, which even 3-year-old children can easily solve, as advanced arithmetic, and praise each other in the circle to satisfy your pitiful self-esteem, then this layer of cloth will soon be torn apart by the decimal system and the multiplication table." Meg's gaze swept across the 5 old men on the stage, as well as the white-robed conservatives in the hall, and a mocking smile appeared on his face as he said, "So, you're already afraid? You're afraid that those ignorant commoners will one day be able to easily solve the problem that you have to rack your brains to solve? When that damn sense of superiority disappears, it's going to be very uncomfortable, right?" The conservatives' faces all changed. Meg's words were like knives. Every sentence was so sharp that it made people feel uncomfortable. Change was a disturbing thing. Those new things made people feel unfamiliar and vigilant. Therefore, they were more willing to continue to stay in this familiar safe zone. No matter how good the new things were, as long as they stayed in the safe zone, they could continue to maintain their current state and stand in a position where people looked up to them. The eyes of the reformists lit up. During this period of time, they had been pushed to the ground by the other party. Moreover, the other party was a leading figure in the academic world, so they were even more cautious when speaking. Unlike Meg, who was as sharp as a knife, they couldn't help but want to cheer. Earlton pointed at Meg and said angrily, You're talking nonsense. Mathematics is not child's play. If a 3-year-old child can calculate two-digit multiplication, I'll stop writing today and go home. However, if you're talking nonsense, then you should tell the world that your so-called multiplication table is nothing but nonsense. Equals. Chapter 794. The debate had already reached the climax, and no one dared to answer Earlton's sharp questions. If the revolutionaries couldn't come up with a response, then the conservative faction would emerge victorious. However, right at this moment, someone suddenly barged into the venue. Everyone turned to look at the strange duo at the entrance. The short-haired young man and the half-elf girl didn't seem to have anything to do with this debate, so they were even more perplexed as to why they were here. "Who is he?" Earlton glowered at Meg with a cold expression. If he could end this debate with a single sentence, then his reputation in the academic world would definitely skyrocket. As such, he was naturally not in a good mood to be interrupted at such a crucial moment. "Is he the chef from the royal banquet yesterday?" Irma faltered slightly at the sight of the father and daughter duo standing at the entrance. He had also attended the royal banquet the day before, so he naturally still remembered this pair of father and daughter. However, he didn't think that he would see them here again. Could it be that the debate was going to provide free meals? Did they invite him here to cook for them? That's right. Why is he here instead of cooking for His Majesty? Roy looked at Meg with furrowed brows. The revolutionaries were also quite perplexed as they didn't know who this intruder was. Teacher Luna. Amy hugged Ugly Duckling a little tighter as she greeted Luna with a smile. Amy, Mr. Meg. A faint smile appeared on Luna's nervous face. Even though he was a little late, Meg had still arrived, and the debate wasn't over yet. My apologies, I was delayed on the way here. Meg nodded in an apologetic manner. He wasn't the one who had made the breakfast, so it was a little difficult for him to choose. He had always been a punctual person. Mr. Meg, this way please. Byron rose to his feet with a smile on his face. All right. Meg gestured for Amy to stand beside Luna while he made his way over to Byron. Eldon said unhappily, Lord Byron, what do you mean? The head-to-head battle was still in progress, so how could they allow irrelevant people to interrupt? What's more, he's a chef who doesn't even know how to count. Do you want a chef to come on stage and debate for you? The people from the conservative faction burst into laughter. They looked at Meg with disdain. How could a chef know how to count? Then wouldn't they be the same as chefs? Not only is Mr. Meg the chef who won the Best Dish award, but he's also the one who came up with the Mammy multiplication table. It's exactly because of his exceptional research that it's so easy to popularize arithmetic, and that's why this debate is taking place. Byron looked at Mag with a hint of approval in his eyes as he said, How can you say that he has nothing to do with this? Among the people present, who was more qualified than him to sit here? Today, he is our 6th debater. He's the Mr. Meg who came up with the Mammy multiplication table. Lister's eyes lit up. The simple and catchy formula was imbued with astonishing wisdom. He had thought that someone who could come up with such an intricate formula had to be an elderly and wise scholar, but who would have thought that it would be a young man who was around his age? The people of the Reformists were also shocked to hear this. If it weren't for the fact that they were amazed by the ingenuity of Mammy's multiplication table, which almost overturned their understanding of mathematics, they wouldn't have switched to the decimal system camp in such a short time and attempted to reform the system as rebels. Furthermore, the person who had come up with such an intricate formula was so young, and he was a chef. The fact that Byron was praising Mag in such a manner made everyone reassess him in a new light. The fact that he had won the Best Dish award at the Palace banquet indicated that his skills as a chef were already at the pinnacle of the world. What kind of mathematical prowess did a chef like him possess? Earlton looked at Meg with a mocking expression, and said, No wonder your so-called multiplication table is so crude, it was created by a chef. Looks like I overestimated this formula. If I had known that this was a slobbering song that a chef came up with in the kitchen, I definitely wouldn't have participated in this debate. The Conservative Party also showed a sense of superiority on their faces. They were born as nobles, and as scholars, they naturally had a sense of superiority. Even if they were facing an ordinary noble, they would feel superior to them, let alone a vulgar chef. Even the people on the reformist side looked a little unnatural. Byron hadn't revealed much information about Meg, so they didn't even know his age, let alone his occupation. For people like them who had already established a foothold in the academic world, it was inevitable that they would find it absurd to work so hard for a formula proposed by a chef. Catchiness is the basis for widespread dissemination. For basic education, this means that it can be infinitely replicated and quickly popularized. Meg stopped in front of the platform and looked at Earlton with a smile as he said, Basic mathematics is a practical subject, it's not some pretentious art. If you try to study two-digit multiplication, which even 3-year-old children can easily solve, as advanced arithmetic, and praise each other in the circle to satisfy your pitiful self-esteem, then this layer of cloth will soon be torn apart by the decimal system and the multiplication table. Meg's gaze swept across the 5 old men on the platform, as well as the white-robed conservatives in the hall, and a mocking smile appeared on his face as he said, So, you're already afraid? Afraid that those ignorant commoners will one day be able to easily come up with an answer that you have to rack your brains to come up with? When that damned sense of superiority disappears, it's going to be very uncomfortable, right? The conservatives' faces all changed. Meg's words were like knives. Every sentence was so sharp that it made people feel uncomfortable. Change was a disturbing thing. Those new things made people feel unfamiliar and vigilant, so they were more willing to continue to stay in this familiar safe zone. No matter how good the new things were, as long as they stayed in the safe zone, they could continue to maintain their current state and stand in a position where people looked up to them. The eyes of the reformists lit up. During this period of time, they had been pushed to the ground by the other party. Moreover, the other party was a leading figure in the academic world, so they were even more cautious when speaking. Unlike Meg, who was as sharp as a knife, they couldn't help but want to cheer. Earlton pointed at Meg and said angrily, You're talking nonsense. Mathematics isn't child's play. If a 3-year-old child can calculate 2-digit multiplication, I'll stop writing and go home from today onward. However, if you're talking nonsense, then you should tell the world that your so-called multiplication table is nothing but nonsense. Equals. Chapter 795. The rules were very simple, and the competition was very fair. It was a little one-sided to determine the superiority of the two systems based on calculation speed, but it was the most direct way to determine the winner. However, the age gap between the adorable Remi and the wise Fei Qi was far too obvious. Even if Fei Qi won under fair rules, he probably wouldn't gain much fame from this duel. Instead, he might even become a joke in the future. Meg was the one who had proposed the rules, and he was also the one who had sent out his daughter. Irma was already making a concession by sending his disciple Fitch instead of himself. Of course, if Irma were to take the field himself, then he would become the laughingstock of the entire Norland continent. Irma looked at Byron, and said in a serious voice, seeing as the rules have been decided, let's begin. This battle over the decimal system had been going on for far too long. Even though the current situation was still within their control, more and more people were trying to learn about the decimal system and the so-called Mammy multiplication table as the revolutionaries continued to build momentum. This wasn't good news, so they had to suppress this matter as soon as possible. If they could make the person who had proposed the Mammy multiplication table admit that it was nothing more than a fabrication, then it would undoubtedly be a devastating blow to the reformists. Byron turned to Mag, and after receiving a slight nod from him, he also nodded, and said, "All right, let's begin." Meg squatted down and turned to Amy with a smile as he said, "Amy, I need you to solve an arithmetic problem now. Do it according to the method that Father taught you, then shout out the answer." Okay. Xiao Mi will definitely win." Amy nodded confidently. During this period of time, she had been learning arithmetic from her father for half an hour every day. "You're just a little brat. How dare you think you can solve a 2-digit multiplication problem? You're dreaming." Earlton pursed his lips as he looked at Amy with disdain in his eyes. He dared to provoke Meg into this bet, so he naturally had absolute confidence in himself. Even he was full of praise for Fitch's calculation speed. Moreover, this child was indeed a genius and had yet to reach the upper limit. As long as he continued to be obedient, these few old fellows did not mind raising him to a higher position. In the future, he might achieve greater achievements than them. "I'm Fitch." Fitch walked up and looked at Amy. He bent down and extended his hand to her, his expression calm and his actions gentlemanly. "I'm Amy." Amy looked up at Fitch and also extended her little hand. However, before her small hand could reach out, it was grabbed by a large hand. After letting go of Amy's hand, Meg looked at Fitch with a smile and said, "I think this will be an interesting duel." "Yes, because you will lose to an opponent called Amy," Amy added with a serious expression. Fitch straightened his back and looked at Meg with a smile as he said, "I've always looked forward to interesting duels, but it's very difficult to find one like this." The middle-aged man who was acting as the MC made his way over to the stage, and announced, "Both contestants, please take your positions. Both contestants will propose a number, which will be converted to decimal and hexadecimal respectively. The first contestant to reach a correct answer will win." Someone had already brought over a pen and paper, as well as 2 tables for Amy and Fitch. The two of them sat back to back with a distance of 3 meters between them. Amy gently placed Ugly Duckling on the table, and said in a quiet voice, "Ugly Duckling, don't run or make a fuss. I'll be fine after a while. Otherwise, I'll eat you." Meow tilde. Ugly Duckling lay down obediently on the table and let loose a soft cry, but it did not dare to move. Fitch sat at the table with a calm expression. Just by sitting there, he gave off a sense of security, indicating that he was a trustworthy person. Meg was also given a pen and paper. After a brief moment of contemplation, he wrote down 56 on a piece of paper and handed it to the MC. Irma also handed a piece of paper to the MC almost at the exact same time. Soon, someone converted the numbers written by both contestants into decimal and hexadecimal before handing them over to Amy and Fitch respectively, and announcing the commencement of the calculation. Amy stared at the two numbers on the paper in a daze, as if she had been given a huge fright. She didn't even pick up her quill. After receiving the question, Fitch began to write on the paper with his quill, and the complex formulas and calculations made everyone feel a little dizzy. A gratified smile appeared on Irma's face as he looked at the two contestants sitting back to back. With Fitch's abilities, it'll take him no more than an hour to solve this question. By that time, that little girl will have already fallen asleep while staring at the paper. He's not even moving his quill, looks like he's going to admit defeat right away. He's using his daughter as a shield, how despicable. All of the conservatives heaved a collective sigh of relief upon hearing this. They were initially a little worried that Meg really would be able to raise a little prodigy, but it appeared that their worries were completely unnecessary. There was most likely no one in this world who was more talented than Fitch, and even if there was, it definitely wouldn't be this 3-year-old half-elf. Why isn't she moving her quill? The revolutionaries were also starting to get a little anxious. Meg's decision to send out Amy had already made them very nervous, but Amy's performance was more like a passive competition. How could she possibly be able to calculate properly when she had placed the cat on the table and was staring at the cat? Amy has even learned how to multiply 2-digit numbers. Luna was also looking at Amy with a nervous expression. After all, even for her, it would take at least an entire day to solve a 2-digit hexadecimal multiplication problem. 3 months ago, Amy couldn't even remember numbers. Only 3 months had passed since then, so how could a 3-year-old child have mastered such advanced calculations? Luna's gaze fell on Meg, and she immediately felt a lot more relieved at the sight of the faint smile on his face. That's right. 3 months ago, Amy couldn't even count properly, but 2 months ago, she learned how to multiply single-digit numbers. With Mr. Meg around, it seems that nothing is impossible. A smile reappeared on Luna's face. The entire hall fell completely silent, and the only sound that could be heard was the sound of Fitch's quill scribbling on a piece of paper. Time seemed to have slowed down to an extremely slow crawl. 16 times 56 is equal to 896, so the answer is 896. Less than half a minute later, Amy suddenly murmured to herself in a low voice. She then grabbed the quill on the table and carefully scribbled down 3 numbers on a piece of paper. She put down the quill and stood up with Ugly Duckling in her arms as she smiled, and said, "I've already calculated the answer, you've lost." Chapter 797. After a brief silence, the entire hall erupted into an uproar. Everyone was unable to disguise their astonishment, and they were almost unable to believe what they had just heard. Fitch has lost. That little girl's calculation was correct. Fitch spent over half an hour to calculate the same answer as that little girl calculated in half a minute. How is that possible? The conservative faction's faces were filled with disbelief. Such a crushing defeat had actually landed on Fitch, who was hailed as the leader of the younger generation. Moreover, his opponent was a little half-elf girl who was only 3 years old. Does that mean we've won? That means that little girl's calculation was correct. She really was able to calculate the correct answer to a 2-digit multiplication problem in half a minute. This is incredible. The decimal system is invincible. All of the revolutionaries faltered momentarily, and they still couldn't believe their eyes. All of a sudden, their extremely disappointed hearts were rekindled, and they were struck by a peculiar feeling. I knew it. Luna jumped with elation, but she quickly realized that her actions were rather unladylike, and a blush appeared on her face as she hurriedly stood still. Thankfully, everyone in the hall was focused on Meg and Amy, so no one had noticed her standing at the entrance of the hall. A smile also appeared on Byron's face as he looked at Meg and Amy with approval in his eyes. As expected, inviting the creator of the Mammy multiplication table to participate in the debate was a good way to break the impasse. That's a man who's willing to admit his loss. Mag looked at Fitch with a hint of surprise and admiration in his eyes. Those so-called prodigies were all very proud and arrogant, yet he was able to publicly admit that he had lost to a 3-year-old child. Furthermore, he didn't express any displeasure or doubt at all, making him appear just like a true man. That's impossible. Earlton abruptly rose to his feet, and his confident expression completely changed. He had bet his honor and academic career on this. If Fitch were to lose, then everything would be over. Loveroy, tell me, what's the result you calculated? It must be different from that little brat's, right? Elton asked as he turned to Leroy with a nervous expression. Everyone in the hall also turned their attention to Roy and List. Fitch had already admitted that Amy's calculation was correct. Now, they only needed to know if their calculations were the same as Fitch's to verify Fitch's words and determine the outcome of this duel. Roy slowly put down his pen and looked at the final answer on the paper before looking up at Earlton with a complex expression. Fitch's answer is correct. My calculations are the same as Fitch's. At this moment, List also put down the quill in his hand and looked at Meg and Amy in his arms, his eyes full of admiration and admiration. How is this possible? Earlton stumbled, and almost fell to the ground. He rushed over to Leroy's table and grabbed the piece of paper on the table. After looking at the final calculations on the paper, his legs gave out from under him, and he fell to the ground with a deathly pale face. The entire hall fell silent, and all of the conservative faction members wore extremely strained expressions. With Roy's status, something that could be easily verified like this couldn't be faked. Otherwise, if news of this were to spread, it would deal a fatal blow to his reputation. The three of them had verified the results, so there was no doubt about the outcome of this duel. Amy had calculated the answer at a terrifying speed of half a minute, crushing the prodigy Fitch, who was hailed as Irma's successor, to clinch the victory. Contestant Amy is the victor of this duel. The MC stepped forward and pointed at Amy. She won. The revolutionaries erupted into raucous cheers. They had been completely dominated in 10 consecutive debates, only to make a comeback in the final duel. Through the miraculous performances of this father-daughter duo, they had managed to turn the tables. This feeling of coming back from the jaws of death was simply too heart-wrenching. Calculating a 2-digit multiplication in half a minute can no longer be described as a prodigy. She's a freak. Most importantly, half a minute doesn't seem to be her limit. According to Mr. Meg, if Amy had used a quill to calculate, she would have done it in less than half a minute. She's so awesome. Could it be that Mr. Meg has even come up with a 2-digit multiplication table? If we learn it, will we also be able to calculate it so quickly? Aside from the raucous cheers, all of the revolutionaries were also discussing quietly among themselves. They had initially been quite skeptical about whether the decimal system and the multiplication table were worth upholding, but after witnessing Amy's fearsome calculation prowess, all of their doubts were dispelled. Now, all of their minds were filled with reverence for Meg and anticipation for their own futures. The research on the hexadecimal system had already reached a stalemate in the field of mathematics, and they would never be ranked in the top echelon of mathematics. However, the decimal system was completely different. This was a completely new field, and they were going to be the first batch of researchers to conduct in-depth research into it. From the looks of it, there was a very high chance that the decimal system would replace the hexadecimal system. These 10 debates were most likely going to go down in the annals of mathematics in the history of the Roth Empire. In particular, this final debate could very well be the key to reversing the course of the Roth Empire's decimal system. Mr. Meg and his daughter, who had come up with the Mammy multiplication table, were destined to leave their mark in the annals of mathematics. Byron stood up and turned to Irma and the others with a smile as he said, "Seeing as the outcome of this debate has been decided, then our agreement will naturally take effect. From this day forth, the Conservatives are not allowed to interfere with the revolutionaries' promotion of the decimal system for any reason. The Ministry of Education will be supervising this matter, so I hope none of you will do anything that violates the agreement. Rest assured, Master Byron. We agreed to this agreement, so of course we won't go back on our word." Irma's expression darkened as he slowly rose to his feet. He turned to Meg and said, "However, I wonder if those scholars will still be willing to learn and promote this so-called multiplication table after learning that it was invented by a chef." Meg looked at Irma with a hint of mockery in his eyes as he said, "The hexadecimal system was most likely invented by a chef who lived in a cave, but aren't all of you still treating it like a treasure? On top of that, the text was originally scribbled on stone walls. Are you going to abandon the use of text just because your ancestor was a primitive man? Me. You sure have a sharp tongue." Irma's expression darkened as he strode out of the hall. Roy took a meaningful glance at Meg before also standing up and departing. Two young scholars helped Irma to his feet before walking past Meg and the others with their heads lowered. "Sir, I hope you still remember what you just said. Tell everyone the good news of your retirement as soon as possible," Meg added with a smile. "You." Irma's eyes widened before he fainted on the spot. "Mr. Meg, right? Can I learn the decimal system from you?" Chapter 798. Everyone who was making their way toward the entrance of the palace turned to look at Fitch with incredulity in their eyes. As Irma's favorite disciple, Fitch had always been groomed by Irma as his successor. With the support of Irma, the #1 arithmetical prodigy in the Roth Empire, Fitch's future was limitless. He was going to be the brightest star in the academic world, and he was going to have the support of countless others. However, such an enviable young man was now going to learn the decimal system from Meg. Meg and his daughter had just given the conservative faction a resounding slap to the face, yet Fitch was going to join them in the blink of an eye. This was no different from destroying one's own future. In the world of arithmetic in the Roth Empire, anyone who offended Irma and the others would never be able to rise again, as there would be countless pairs of feet waiting to trample on them. Aside from surprise, the conservative faction was also enraged. Fitch's actions were tantamount to betrayal, and they were unable to accept this. Even the revolutionaries were looking at Fitch with perplexed expressions. The revolutionaries had won some ground due to Meg and his daughter, but the hexadecimal system had been prevalent in the human race for several decades, so the decimal system was definitely going to take some time to popularize. Was Fitch really going to give up on his bright future? Irma, who had just reached the entrance of the palace, harumphed coldly before exiting without even looking back. His academic career is over. The conservative faction looked at Fitch with wistful expressions before also exiting the palace. Some of them were even gloating over his misfortune. Meg looked at Fitch for a while before shaking his head and saying, "I'm sorry, but I don't accept students. If you want to learn arithmetic, you can look for Master Byron. He's more professional than I am. I'm just a chef who doesn't know arithmetic." Fitch shook his head with a firm expression as he said, "No, I just want to learn from you. I want to learn the method she used to calculate a 2-digit multiplication in less than half a minute. I don't care what my master does or who he is. Knowledge doesn't change because of people. What feels different is the human heart." Meg looked at Fitch's determined expression and pure eyes, and was silent for a while before shaking his head. "I'm not taking any disciples. I'm going back to Chaos City tomorrow. If you really want to learn the decimal system and multiplication, you can join the revolutionaries. If you have any questions, you can write to me. Deal?" Fitch's eyes lit up as he bowed deeply towards Meg. A smile appeared on Meg's face as he nodded. "It's a deal." Fitch turned around and walked towards Byron, humbly conversing with him. He could tell that Byron was in a good mood. "Father, didn't Amy do a great job?" Amy raised her little head, her little face full of praise. Meg smiled and nodded. Yes, Xiao Mi did very well. Her arithmetic is already better than those old grandpas. That's right. Little Amy beat the best arithmetic prodigy in Rodu today. You did very well. Luna made her way over to Amy and gave her a thumbs up. Hee hee. Amy was elated to be praised by both Meg and Luna. She swung Meg's arm from side to side and whispered into his ear, "Father, put me down. I'm going to play hide and seek with Ugly Duckling over there. I won't disturb your conversation with Teacher Luna." Meg didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he put Amy down onto the ground. He didn't know what she was thinking. Luna took a glance at Fitch before turning to Meg with a smile, and said, "Fitch is an extremely talented person. Aren't you going to consider taking him as your disciple?" Meg shook his head with a smile, and said, "I'm a chef, not a teacher. If he's a cooking prodigy, perhaps I'll consider it." Luna couldn't help but chuckle, and said, "It's a good thing you didn't say that in front of them. Otherwise, there would definitely be a lot of people who would want to beat you up." Meg's sharp words had slightly upended his gentle and kind image in her heart, but that didn't make her feel uncomfortable in the slightest. Instead, she felt as if she was getting to know him better. A man like that made her feel more secure. Meg chatted with Luna for a while longer about promoting the decimal system, and he turned around to discover that Amy had disappeared. He hurriedly apologized to Luna before quickly making his way toward the place where Amy had been playing. After circling around the stone pillars, Meg was still unable to find Amy, and he was starting to get a little panicked. "There's a door here. Could Amy have gone out through here?" Luna was also looking around anxiously when she suddenly discovered a small door that was slightly ajar on the side of the hall. She turned to Meg with a question. "I'll go take a look." Meg quickly made his way over to the small door, which was just wide enough for Amy and Ugly Duckling to pass through. She couldn't be found anywhere in the hall, so it was most likely that she had chased Ugly Duckling out through this small door. After exiting the hall through the side door, they were greeted by the sight of a cluster of domed buildings. Evergreen trees littered the halls, and there was not a single person in sight. "Amy! Amy!" Meg yelled as he looked around. There were simply too many buildings and trees here, and if Amy were to get lost, she would definitely panic. Furthermore, if something were to happen to her, he wouldn't be able to get there immediately, and that made him feel very uneasy. "Don't worry, Mr. Meg. The church's priests are all kind and gentle people, and little Amy is so smart. She'll be fine." Luna followed him out of the hall. She looked at the nervous Meg, and consoled him, "Let's look around first. If we still can't find her, I'll ask grandfather to negotiate with the church and ask them to help us find her." "All right." Meg nodded. He walked in a direction and scanned his surroundings with a sharp gaze. At the same time, he said in his mind, "System, locate Amy for me." "My apologies, host. The system doesn't provide personal location services." The system's old-fashioned voice sounded, but it quickly turned into a playful one. "However, the system can provide you with a location watch service. Worried that your child will get lost? Worried that you won't be able to find your child? Don't worry. Little Genius Phone Watch will solve all your problems. No matter where you are, I can find you immediately with just a phone call. Hello. I can find you with just a phone call. I can find you with just a phone call. Scram. Meg's brows were tightly knitted together as he listened to the repeated advertisements in his mind. After looking around for more than 10 minutes and going through several halls, Meg still couldn't find Amy, and his expression became even more serious. "Why don't?" Luna also looked a little anxious, and she walked up to him and was about to say something. Meow tilde just then, a soft meow of a cat came from the side. "It's Ugly Duckling." Meg's gaze immediately turned to the majestic hall on his right. The thick wooden door, which was 5 or 6 meters tall, was tightly shut, but he was sure that the meow of the cat had come from there. Meg quickly walked up and pushed open the 2 thick doors. He looked inside and was stunned. Chapter 799. The heavy wooden door slowly opened inward, and a dimly lit hall gradually unfolded before Meg's eyes. In the deepest part of the hall, An old man with a crown on his head sat on a tall chair. A huge diamond-studded scepter shone brightly in his hand, evoking reverence and even an urge to kneel down and worship him. Walking down the gem-studded stone steps, there was a small figure standing in the center of the hall. A beam of light shone down from the dome and landed on her body. The specks of light shone brightly, as if covering her with a layer of golden gauze. That little figure was none other than Amy, whom Meg had been looking for a long time, but he didn't know why she was here. "It's His Holiness. He won't hurt Amy," Luna said softly as she held back Meg, who was about to enter the hall. Meg hesitated momentarily before stopping in his tracks. He looked at the old man sitting on the throne like a statue, and his benevolent face made one feel defenseless against him. His light blue eyes were fixed on Amy as if he were looking at a dazzling diamond. What is he trying to do? Meg was still a little wary. This Pope, Cant, had killed 2 generations of kings of the Roth Empire, and watched the church fall from prosperity to decline, but he had always kept the church in check, and had never shown any hostility or retaliation. However, when it came to Amy, he still couldn't completely trust him. Under the illumination of the golden light, Amy reached out her little hand curiously. She looked at the golden light in her hand, and a joyful smile appeared on her little face. Specks of golden light began to converge on her back, forming a pair of semi-transparent golden wings. With a gentle flap, Amy's legs left the ground, and she hovered in the air. "Wow! I can fly!" Amy exclaimed in surprise. She tried to control the flapping of her wings, and her body flew higher and higher. Although it was still a little unstable, she was indeed flying. "Meow, meow." Ugly Duckling looked up at Amy with a panicked expression as it waved its front paws with all its might, as if it were trying to fly. "This light." Meg looked at Amy in surprise. There were some races in this world that could fly, such as vampires, but normal elves were definitely not included. Unless they could use magic to create wings, or they could borrow some magic items such as brooms and the like. However, there was absolutely no elf that could create a pair of wings out of thin air to fly without using magic. Then, the only possibility was that the beam of light that fell on Amy was still following Amy like a spotlight even when she was flying. However, Amy, who was flapping her little wings, still looked very cute. She was like a little flower fairy, and the holy light that shone on her made people unable to look away. The chosen one. She really is the chosen one. I really didn't think. The Pope looked up at Amy, who was dancing in the golden light, and a hint of excitement appeared in his calm and wise eyes. "Oh ho!" Amy flapped her little wings and flew in the spacious palace. After a while, she suddenly discovered Meg and Luna standing at the entrance of the palace. She was immediately pleasantly surprised. "Father. Teacher Luna. Look, I can fly." Meg smiled and waved at Amy. "Amy, come down first." "Millimeter." Amy responded obediently, and controlled her wings to fly toward Meg. However, she didn't control her speed well during her descent, and fell when she was about 2 meters off the ground. Fortunately, Meg reacted quickly and caught her. "Hee, I knew Father would catch me." A happy smile appeared on Amy's face. She turned her head and looked behind her. Her little golden wings were still there, and her smile became even brighter. She then said to the Pope, who was sitting high up on the throne, "Shiny old grandpa, I really have a pair of little wings now. Thank you. You were chosen by God. If you want to thank someone, you should be thanking God." The Pope looked at Amy with a smile, and said, "Little one, are you willing to join our church and become the church's holy maiden? If you are willing, you can be crowned as the empress in the future and become the owner of this palace." Luna's mouth gradually gaped open. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The Pope wanted Amy to become the holy maiden, and was preparing to make her the next Pope? This was crazy. Meg also couldn't hide the shock on his face. Amy had only played hide and seek, and the Pope had chosen her to become the holy maiden, and she was going to be the next Pope? Even for someone like him who had seen the world, this development was a little difficult to digest. Although the church was no longer as powerful and influential as it used to be, it still had a strong influence among the upper echelons of the Roth Empire. Even when Andre ascended to the throne, He had to kneel on the ground and kiss the back of the Pope's hand. Only then would he be crowned as the true king. However, the Pope had promised such a position in the Roth Empire to Amy so easily. This was like a dream. Before Meg had a chance to think, Amy shook her head at the Pope with a serious expression, and said, "I'm sorry, shiny old grandpa. I don't like to sit so high up, and this palace is a little dark, so I don't want this seat. I want to live in the restaurant with father. That way, I can eat all kinds of delicious food when I wake up every day." An opportunity to stand at the pinnacle of the continent had been so easily turned down by Amy with the excuse of delicious food. This feeling was as if a bowl of sweet tofu pudding was more worthy of her affection than the Pope. Fortunately, there was no one else here. Otherwise, Meg would have to be very careful and on guard against sneak attacks from jealous passers-by. The Pope was also clearly stunned. He clearly didn't think that someone would refuse to become the Pope, and use such a reason. He looked at Amy's serious expression, and smiled gently as he said, "If you become the Pope, you will have a lot of power. No one on the Norland continent will be able to hurt you or the people you want to protect. Of course, you can also eat whatever you want. Someone will prepare everything for you. But I only want to eat father's food. I only want to live with father. I don't want to live with anyone else." Amy shook her head, and said, "Besides, I'm super powerful now. I'll definitely be able to protect father in the future." Meg felt that if this conversation were to spread, it would definitely cause a huge commotion. After all, no one in this world would reject the Pope's invitation and the opportunity to become the Pope for such a reason. This was indeed very crazy. Chapter 800. The Pope looked at Amy, his clear and wise eyes full of admiration and praise. He was not the slightest bit displeased by Amy's rejection. Yes, even if you don't become a divine lady, you will still become an extraordinary person and protect your father well. The Pope looked at Amy with a smile and paused for a moment before continuing, "But if you become the Pope, you will be able to protect all kind-hearted humans and give them shelter." Kind-hearted humans? A thoughtful look appeared on Amy's face. After thinking for a while, she looked up at the Pope and asked, "But have you protected them?" The smile on the Pope's face gradually faded, and he looked at Amy with a deep gaze. When did this little one become so crafty with her questions? Meg looked at Amy with some surprise, and his eyes were full of admiration. Being able to see if there was something strange hidden in the pie that someone threw at her was undoubtedly a very good ability. However, Meg looked at the Pope with some caution. Although the Pope, who was known for being a good person, had not shown any hostility from beginning to end, no one could guarantee that he would not fly into a rage out of humiliation after hearing Amy's question. This was because the current church clearly had no ability to protect kind-hearted people. What they needed to worry about now was how to protect the last remaining Carlo Cathedral. Luna also had a worried look on her face. Although the church was declining, she had never heard any stories about the church from her grandfather when she was young. Even her grandfather would bow respectfully when he saw the Pope. This was an old man who was respected by many people. The Pope was silent for a while, and then he looked at Amy and said in a slightly low voice, "I used to work hard to protect them, but one day, I realized that what I did was instead causing them more harm, or bringing them more pain. So, I chose to become a bystander and not let the church get too involved in the lives of ordinary people. If your help causes them more pain, then it must be because you did not find the right way to help them. You can't say that helping them is wrong. You should correct your methods and not choose to run away." Amy frowned and said sympathetically, "If those kind people pray for your help but you don't care about them, wouldn't that be very cruel to them?" The Pope's eyes gradually lit up. He stood up unconsciously and raised his head slightly to look at the dome that cast golden light. His eyes flickered a little. "Father, did I say something wrong?" Amy whispered in Meg's ear. Meg shook her head and said with a smile, "No, Amy said it very well. If it were anyone else here, they probably wouldn't be able to say such words to the Pope." The Pope withdrew his gaze from the dome and looked down at Amy. He asked kindly, "Young lady, what's your name?" Amy answered crisply. Amy, whether you're willing or not, the position of goddess will always be reserved for you. If you're willing to join the church one day, I'll crown you as the queen." The Pope looked out of the palace with a sharp gaze, and said with a smile, "As for me, it's time for the church to do what it needs to do again." Amy turned to look at the pair of faint golden wings on her back, and asked with a conflicted expression, "What about these wings? If I refuse, do I have to return them to you?" She really liked the feeling of flying, and it didn't require any magic power. This feeling was simply too interesting. The Pope shook his head with a smile, and said, "This is a blessing from God, and only God can take it back. You're God's chosen one, and God won't make the wrong choice." A joyful smile appeared on Amy's face. "Wow, then you have to thank God for me. I really like these wings." The Pope nodded with a smile before sitting back down. Meg and Luna bowed respectfully toward the Pope before carrying Amy and Ugly Duckling out of the palace. The heavy wooden door slowly closed behind them, and the intricate wooden carvings on the door gave off a sense of solemnity. Amy said to Meg before flapping her wings and flying out of Meg's arms. She flew through the trees in a nimble manner, and her two little silver braids swayed gently from side to side. Her tinkling laughter rang out throughout the entire church. Many of the preachers made their way over to the window to look at Amy and the pair of little golden wings on her back with astonishment in their eyes. Some of the older preachers were unable to hide their excitement as they clasped their hands together and prayed softly. "Meow, meow." Ugly Duckling ran on the ground, trying its best to catch up to Amy. "Ugly Duckling, do you want to come up and play as well?" Amy suddenly stopped in midair and looked down at Ugly Duckling with a smile. "Meow." Ugly Duckling was given a fright, and it slipped and fell headfirst into a pile of dried leaves. Its entire head was buried in the leaves, and it remained in that position. "It's useless even if you pretend to be dead." A demonic voice sounded in its ears, and Ugly Duckling tried its best to bury its head deeper into the leaves. It was like an ostrich that had stuffed its head into the sand with its butt exposed. It was then dragged out of the pile of leaves by Amy. Amy held Ugly Duckling in front of her and looked at it with a serious expression as she said, "Even though you're an ugly duckling now, you have to remember that you're going to become a white swan in the future. If you're afraid of heights, then do you want to become a white swan that runs on the ground?" "Meow, meow." Ugly Duckling blinked its big blue eyes with an aggrieved expression. Tears were already welling up in its eyes, making it look like a scared little child. "Good luck, you can do it." Amy rubbed its little cat head before flapping her little wings, and she instantly flew higher into the air. "Meow." Howl. Meg looked at Ugly Duckling, which was crying out in a husky voice, and was struck by a sense of pity and amusement. He couldn't help but think to himself, could it be that Ugly Duckling is also a husky like Little Purple? After letting Amy play for a while, Meg saw that more and more preachers were paying attention to Amy, so he waved a hand at Amy, and said, "Come down, Amy. We have to go." Amy dove down from the sky with Ugly Duckling in her arms, and she landed right into Meg's arms. The vibrant smile on her face was a stark contrast to the tear-stained Ugly Duckling. "Howl." Meow. Ugly Duckling opened its eyes and looked at Amy with an aggrieved expression. "Well done, Ugly Duckling. I'll take you to the sky every day from now on." Amy patted Ugly Duckling's head with a smile. Meow. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.